The Beast of Blackwood Mountain. The innkeeper's boot caught Lydia Hale square in the ribs, driving the air from her lungs as the crowd roared with laughter. Blood from her split lip mixed with the wine, staining Mrs. Crawford's ruined dress. The dress Lydia's clumsy hands had destroyed. "You're worthless here," he snarled, yanking her up by her hair. "But I know someone who'll take you. The beast up on Blackwood Mountain needs a woman." Terror flooded through her as rough hands bound her wrists. By dawn, she'd be given to the monster, payment for her disgrace, a sacrifice to the wilderness. Thank you for joining Lydia's journey. Please watch until the end to see how her story unfolds. Hit the like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The Wyoming Territory knew how to be cruel, but the Crossroads Inn had perfected it into an art form. Lydia Hale learned this truth with every whispered insult, every accidental shove, every plate of scraps thrown at her feet instead of handed to her properly. At 23 years old and carrying more weight than the town deemed acceptable for an unmarried woman, she'd become the inn's favorite target, part servant, part spectacle, wholly disposable. The kitchen was her domain by default. No one else wanted to work the grease-splattered stove or haul the cast-iron pots that left her arms aching by nightfall. She'd arrived at the Crossroads 2 years prior, orphaned and desperate, willing to accept any terms for a roof overhead and a corner to sleep in. The innkeeper, Gerald Cutler, had looked her up and down with those calculating eyes and named his price. Room and board in exchange for labor, with wages to be discussed once you've proven your worth. The wages never materialized. The worth was never proven. But the work never stopped. "Lydia, where's that roast? Table 6 has been waiting 20 minutes. She grabbed the platter with both hands, the heat searing through the thin cloth she'd wrapped around the handles. The dining room was packed tonight. A stagecoach had arrived unexpectedly, bringing a dozen passengers seeking shelter from the late autumn storm hammering against the windows. Among them was Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, a Denver socialite traveling east with enough trunks to stock a general store and enough complaints to fill a ledger. Lydia maneuvered through the crowded room, keeping her eyes down, making herself small despite her size. It was a trick she'd learned early. If you didn't draw attention, sometimes you could move through the world unnoticed. Sometimes. "Good Lord, they let her serve the food?" Mrs. Crawford's voice carried over the din. "Gerald, I'm paying for quality service, not—" "Ma'am, I assure you the food is excellent." Cutler appeared at the woman's elbow, his smile tight. "Lydia, set it down and get back to the kitchen." She placed the platter carefully on the table, grateful to escape. But as she turned, her hip caught the edge of Mrs. Crawford's chair. The woman had leaned back at precisely the wrong moment, and Lydia's water pitcher, balanced precariously on her serving tray, tipped forward. It happened in slow motion. The pitcher arced through the air, crystal clear water catching the lamplight, then cascading down in a perfect sheet across Mrs. Crawford's emerald traveling dress. The room went silent. "You clumsy, worthless—" Mrs. Crawford shot to her feet, water streaming from the expensive fabric. "This dress costs more than you'll earn in a lifetime. It's ruined! Ruined!" "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Lydia reached for a cloth, her hands shaking. Cutler's hand clamped around her wrist, fingers digging deep enough to bruise. "Get away from her." His voice was low, dangerous. "Get to the kitchen, now." She stumbled backward, colliding with another table. Laughter erupted from the crowd, some genuine amusement, some nervous energy seeking release. Heat flooded her face as she fled, their mockery following her like a pack of wolves. In the kitchen, she pressed her back against the wall and tried to breathe. It was an accident, just an accident, but accidents had consequences here, and she knew better than to hope for mercy. The door slammed open. Cutler filled the frame, backlit by the dining room's warm glow, his face cast in shadow. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He advanced slowly, deliberately. "That woman is the wife of a territorial judge. She could ruin me with a word." "It was an accident, Mr. Cutler. Please. Accident? You're the accident. A mistake I've tolerated for 2 years because I thought you might eventually be worth the scraps I feed you." He grabbed an iron poker from beside the stove. "But you're not worth it. You're nothing but a burden." The first blow caught her across the shoulders. She crumpled, instinct driving her to the floor, arms raised to protect her head. "Mr. Cutler, please." The poker whistled down again, striking her ribs. Pain exploded through her chest, driving the air from her lungs. She tasted copper, realized she'd bitten her tongue. You want to know what you're worth? Another blow, this one across her back. Nothing. Less than nothing. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard boots on floorboards. Voices. Someone had come from the dining room. Gerald, that's enough. This voice was older, gruff. Samuel Garrett, one of the regulars. You've made your point. Have I? Cutler's breathing was labored. Because I'm done making points. I'm done with her entirely. Lydia curled tighter, waiting for the next strike. It didn't come. Instead, Cutler's boots appeared in her limited field of vision, close enough that she could see the mud caked on the heels. There's a man lives up on Blackwood Mountain, he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Rowan Blackwood. You've heard the stories, haven't you, Lydia? She had. Everyone had. The mountain man who'd killed a family in cold blood. The beast who ate travelers foolish enough to venture too close to his territory. The monster parents invoked to frighten misbehaving children. I've heard. Good. Then you know what he is. Cutler crouched beside her, his smile visible now, cruel and satisfied. Here's what's going to happen. At dawn, I'm taking you up that mountain. I'm giving you to Blackwood as payment for Mrs. Crawford's dress and the damage to my reputation. Maybe he'll keep you. Maybe he'll kill you. Either way, you're not my problem anymore. You can't. I can do whatever I want. You're nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. You think anyone will miss you? You think anyone will even ask? Silence from the doorway confirmed it. Samuel Garrett, who'd objected to the beating, said nothing about the disposal. No one did. Please. The words scraped out of her, raw and desperate. I'll work harder. I'll pay for the dress somehow. Please don't. Should have thought of that before you destroyed a $100 garment. Cutler stood, brushing off his knees. Samuel, lock her in the root cellar. Make sure she doesn't run. Strong hands hauled her up. Garrett's face was carefully neutral as he guided her toward the back stairs, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to buckle. The pain in her ribs screamed with each step. I'm sorry, girl, he murmured as they descended into the darkness beneath the inn. But you did make a mess of things. The root cellar smelled of earth and old vegetables. Garrett lowered her onto a pile of burlap sacks, gentle despite his complicity. You really mean it? Her voice sounded small in the confined space. About the mountain? Gerald doesn't make idle threats. Garrett moved toward the stairs. If I were you, I'd pray Blackwood's in a merciful mood. The door closed. A bolt slid home. Footsteps faded. Lydia sat in the darkness, arms wrapped around her damaged ribs, and tried to understand how her life had come to this. 2 years of brutal work, of swallowing pride and enduring cruelty, and it ended with her being given away like spoiled goods, traded to a monster for the price of a ruined dress. She'd heard the stories about Rowan Blackwood since her first week at the crossroads, how he'd been run out of Denver after a patient died under suspicious circumstances, how he'd retreated to the mountain like a wounded animal, growing more savage with each passing year, how travelers who ventured too close to his cabin were never seen again. Some said he was 7 feet tall, with hands big enough to crush a man's skull. Others claimed he was hideously scarred, driven mad by isolation. All agreed he was dangerous, a beast wearing a man's shape, tolerated only because he stayed in the high country and left the town alone. And tomorrow, she'd be delivered to his doorstep. The hours crawled past. Cold seeped up from the earthen floor, settling into her bones. She dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time her body shifted and pain flared in her ribs. Through the floorboards above, she heard the inn settling for the night. Footsteps crossing and recrossing, doors closing, voices fading to silence. Eventually, even the storm quieted. Dawn came as a thin line of gray light beneath the cellar door. Lydia pushed herself upright, every muscle protesting. Her dress was torn, stained with blood and wine and dirt. Her face felt swollen, her lips split and crusted. She must look like something dragged behind a horse. Fitting, she supposed, for a woman being given to a monster. The bolt scraped back. Cutler descended, carrying a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. Time to go. He bound her wrists without ceremony, the rope biting into already bruised skin. When she stumbled on the stairs, he yanked her forward hard enough to make her cry out. Quiet. You'll wake the guests. A wagon waited in the pre-dawn darkness, hitched to two sturdy horses stamping impatiently in the cold. Cutler lifted her into the bed like a sack of grain, showing no more care. She landed hard, fresh pain blooming across her shoulders. Please, she tried one more time. I can work off the debt. You're not worth the food you eat. He climbed onto the driver's bench, gathering the reins. Blackwood can decide what to do with you. The wagon lurched forward. Lydia braced herself against the wooden sides as they rolled through the sleeping town and onto the mountain road. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose that seemed obscene in their beauty. She was going to die on this mountain. She knew it with the same certainty she knew winter would come and the sun would rise. Cutler was delivering her to a killer, washing his hands of a problem, and no one would ever ask what became of the fat cook from the Crossroads Inn. The road deteriorated as they climbed. Smooth, packed dirt gave way to rocks and ruts that rattled her teeth and sent fresh spikes of agony through her injured ribs. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, their branches meeting overhead to block out the growing light. The temperature dropped with each turn of the wheels. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Cutler pulled the horses to a stop. End of the road! Lydia raised her head. They'd reached a small clearing where the track simply ended. Beyond it, the forest grew thick and wild, untouched by axes or human passage. Somewhere in that wilderness lived the beast. Cutler climbed down and dragged her from the wagon. Her legs, numb from cold and disuse, buckled. She fell hard, bound hands unable to break her fall. Blackwood's cabin is 3 miles north. He pointed vaguely into the trees. Follow the game trail. If you're lucky, you'll find it before nightfall. You're not taking me there? I'm not stupid enough to knock on that devil's door. He returned to the wagon, gathering the reins. You want to run? Run. You want to hide? Hide. Either way, you're not coming back down this mountain. Wait. But he'd already turned the horses. The wagon rolled away, wheels crunching over pine needles and stones, taking with it the last connection to the world she knew. Within minutes, even the sound faded, swallowed by the vast silence of the high country. Lydia lay where she'd fallen, rope cutting into her wrists, body screaming with pain. The smart thing would be to run, to find a different path down the mountain, to take her chances in another town where no one knew her name. But she'd tried running before. After her parents died, after the farm was sold for debts, after every door in her hometown closed against an orphaned girl with no prospects and too much appetite. Running had brought her to the crossroads. Running had earned her 2 years of abuse and a one-way trip to the wilderness. She was done running. Lydia rolled onto her side, then pushed herself to her knees. The world spun, nausea rising sharp in her throat. She breathed through it, waiting for the dizziness to pass, then struggled to her feet. North. 3 miles. Before nightfall. The game trail was barely visible, just a slight depression in the forest floor where deer and elk had passed often enough to mark a route. She followed it, moving slowly, arms held awkwardly in front of her, bound wrists already going numb. The forest was beautiful in its indifference. Massive pines towered overhead, their trunks thick as wagon wheels, their needles carpeting the ground in rust-colored softness. Somewhere nearby, water rushed over rocks, a creek or stream, the sound both soothing and strange. Birds called to each other in languages she didn't understand. None of it cared that she was dying. Because she was dying. She could feel it in the way her breathing had grown shallow and painful, in the cold sweat on her skin despite the autumn chill, in the strange lightness creeping into her head. The beating had done more damage than she'd realized, or perhaps it was just the culmination of 2 years of slowly breaking down under impossible weight. Either way, she wouldn't make 3 miles. The trail began to climb more steeply. Her feet, clad only in thin kitchen shoes, slipped on loose stones. She fell twice, each impact driving what little air remained from her lungs. The second time, she lay still for a long moment, tempted to simply close her eyes and let it end here. But something stubborn in her core, the same thing that had kept her going through 2 years at the crossroads, forced her back to her feet. One step, then another, then another. The sun climbed higher, though little light penetrated the thick canopy. Time lost meaning. There was only the trail, the pain, the mechanical process of moving forward because stopping meant death. She almost missed the cabin. It appeared suddenly as the trail crested a small rise, a low structure built from dark timber nestled against the mountain's face like something that had grown there rather than been constructed. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, gray against the blue sky. Someone was home. Lydia stopped at the edge of the clearing, fear finally catching up to her exhausted body. This was it, the beast's lair. Beyond this point, there was no uncertainty left, only whatever waited inside those walls. Her legs made the decision for her. They simply stopped working, folding beneath her like wet paper. She went down hard, face first in the dirt, and this time she couldn't get up. The cabin door opened. Through her fading vision, she saw a shape emerge. Tall, impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate care of something very strong trying not to break the world around it. As it approached, details resolved, dark hair pulled back, a thick beard, clothes worn but clean, and hands. She saw the hands first as they reached for her, huge hands scarred across the knuckles, capable of terrible violence, capable of crushing her skull without effort. Easy. The voice was deep, rough from disuse, but not cruel. Don't try to move. Those massive hands rolled her gently onto her back. A face came into view, weathered, stern, with eyes the color of winter storms. Not handsome exactly, but not monstrous either. Just hard, shaped by isolation and grief into something that had forgotten softness. Who did this? The question emerged flat, emotionless, but she heard something underneath it, something that might have been anger. She tried to answer. Her mouth wouldn't form words. The man, Blackwood, it had to be, produced a knife. For one terrible moment she thought this was it, the quick end the stories promised. But he only cut the ropes binding her wrists, his movements precise and careful. Beaten, abandoned. He was speaking more to himself than her. And they wonder why I left. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted her like she weighed nothing. She wanted to protest. No one had carried her since childhood. She was too heavy, too much. But consciousness was slipping away like water through cupped hands. The last thing she registered was warmth. The cabin's interior was warm, and somewhere nearby a fire crackled, and the arms carrying her were steady and sure. Then darkness took her, and for the first time in days the pain receded. When awareness returned, it came gradually. Warmth first, blessed, encompassing warmth that seemed to seep into bones that had forgotten what it felt like to be anything but cold. Then softness beneath her, nothing like the cornhusk mattress in her cellar room at the crossroads. Real bedding, clean and dry. She opened her eyes. A low ceiling of timber beams, walls chinked with what looked like clay and moss, a single window showing afternoon light, which meant she'd lost hours. And beside the bed, a chair where the mountain man sat, reading a book with the careful attention of someone for whom books were precious things. He noticed her watching. Set the book aside, medical text, she glimpsed the title, and leaned forward. How do you feel? Lydia took inventory. Her ribs still ached, but the sharp stabbing pain had dulled to a more manageable throb. Her face felt tender, swollen, but the splitting headache had receded. And most surprisingly, she was clean. Someone had washed the blood and dirt from her skin, changed her into a nightshirt that smelled of lye soap and pine. You undressed me. I'm a doctor. He said it simply as if that explained everything. Or was before. Your ribs are cracked but not broken. The cuts and bruises will heal. You'll be sore for a while. The innkeeper sent me, better to get it over with, as payment for a dress I ruined. He said that you were a monster? A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face. Yes, I've heard the stories. They get more creative each year. You're not going to kill me? Why would I kill you? He stood, moving to a small table where a kettle steamed over a spirit lamp. You need rest, food, and time to heal. Then you can decide what you want to do. Decide? Whether to stay or go. He poured something that smelled of herbs into a tin cup. I won't keep you prisoner, if that's what you're asking. He brought the cup to her, helping her sit up enough to drink. The liquid was bitter but warming, spreading through her chest like summer sun. The innkeeper, she said when she could speak again. Cutler. He won't let me come back. Then don't go back. Blackwood returned to his chair, settling into it with the careful economy of a large man in a small space. Plenty of room on this mountain. You don't even know me. I know enough. He picked up his book but didn't open it. I know someone beat you badly enough to crack your ribs. I know they tied you up and abandoned you on a mountain trail. I know you still walked 3 miles to reach this cabin instead of trying to run. I couldn't run. You could have tried. You didn't. He met her eyes directly, and she saw something in that gaze that made her breath catch. Recognition. You came here to die, didn't you? The words hit too close to truth. She looked away. I thought so. He opened his book, settled back. Well, you're not dying today, and tomorrow doesn't look promising for it either, so you might as well rest. Outside, wind stirred the pines. Inside, the fire crackled quietly. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lydia Hale felt something that might have been safety. It wouldn't last, she knew that. Nothing good ever did. But for now, for this moment, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the stories about the beast of Blackwood Mountain had gotten it wrong. The question hung in the air between them. Weighted, honest, impossible to avoid. Lydia turned her face toward the window, watching late afternoon light filter through glass that was surprisingly clean for a hermit's cabin. I didn't think past reaching the door, she finally admitted. Whether I died on the trail or after. It didn't seem to matter much. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the whisper of pages as he marked his place in the medical text. It matters. Does it? The bitterness surprised her, bubbling up from some deep well she'd kept carefully sealed at the crossroads. To who? Cutler was right about one thing. Nobody's going to ask what happened to me. Nobody's going to miss me. I would have missed finding you on my trail. He set the book aside completely now, giving her his full attention in a way that made her uncomfortable. People didn't look at her like this, like she was worth the effort of focus. Another few hours and you wouldn't have made it. The cold would have taken you. Maybe that would have been easier. Maybe. He stood, moving to the stove where something simmered in a cast-iron pot. But you didn't choose easy. You chose to walk. The aroma that drifted from the pot made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. How long since she'd eaten? The previous morning, before the disaster with Mrs. Crawford's dress. Over 30 hours of fear and pain and cold. Rowan ladled thick stew into a wooden bowl, cut a generous slice from a loaf of dark bread, and brought both to her. Eat slowly. Your stomach won't thank you if you rush it. The first bite nearly made her weep. Venison, rich and tender, with root vegetables and herbs she couldn't name. Real food, not the scraps and burnt offerings that had been her portion at the inn. She forced herself to follow his instruction, taking small bites, letting each one settle before reaching for the next. He watched her eat with the clinical detachment of someone assessing a patient's recovery, then seemed satisfied and turned his attention to the window. Storm's coming. You can smell it in the air. Lydia paused, bread halfway to her mouth. How long do storms last up here? This time of year? Could be 3 days, could be a week. He glanced at her, something that might have been amusement touching his expression. Don't worry, I won't throw you out into it. I wasn't, but she had been worrying exactly that. I don't want to be a burden. You're not strong enough to be a burden yet. When you can stand without help, we'll discuss it. He moved to the shelves lining one wall, scanning the contents with the ease of long familiarity. For now, you eat, you rest, you heal. Everything else can wait. She finished the stew and bread, her stomach pleasantly full for the first time in recent memory. Rowan took the empty bowl, replaced it with a cup of water from a pitcher that tasted of mountain stone and minerals. The nightshirt, she said, needing to address it. My dress was ruined. I burned it. He said this matter-of-factly, rinsing the bowl in a basin. The nightshirt is clean. You can keep it. I don't have anything else. I'm aware. He dried his hands on a cloth, deliberate and thorough. I have fabric. If you're staying more than a few days, we can make something that fits. If she was staying. The conditional settled over her like the blanket across her legs, warm but temporary, subject to change without notice. Outside, the light was fading toward evening. Through the window, she could see the clearing around the cabin, and beyond it, the dark mass of pines stretching down the mountain. No lights visible anywhere, no signs of human habitation, just wilderness and sky and the coming storm. Why do they call you a monster? The question escaped before she could think better of it. Rowan's hand stilled on the cloth. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped the unspoken boundaries of their arrangement. Then he hung the cloth carefully on a peg and turned to face her. Because it's easier than the truth, which is that I failed to save a child and someone needed to be blamed. His voice remained level, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Denver, 3 years ago. I was a physician, a good one. A family came to me with their daughter. Fever, seizures, deteriorating fast. I did everything I knew, everything I'd been taught. It wasn't enough. He moved to the fireplace, adding a log with precise placement. Sparks rose and died in the updraft. The father was a prominent man, connected, rich enough that when his daughter died, he needed an explanation that didn't involve the simple truth that sometimes medicine fails. So he claimed I'd given her the wrong treatment, that I'd been drunk, careless, negligent. The wood caught, flames licking along fresh bark. By the time I proved my innocence, my practice was destroyed. My reputation was ashes. The medical board cleared me officially, but nobody forgets that kind of accusation. So you came here. So I came here. He settled back into his chair, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. Built this cabin with my own hands, taught myself to hunt, to trap, to survive. And people being people, they invented stories to explain why a doctor would choose exile over civilization. The stories say you killed a family. The stories say a lot of things. A bitter smile touched his mouth. They say I eat human flesh during the full moon, that I steal children from their beds, that I'm 7 feet tall and strong enough to tear a man in half. He gestured to himself. Tall, yes, but not impossibly so, broad, but proportional. Which parts do you believe? Lydia studied him in the shifting light. The hands that had carried her so carefully, that had cleaned her wounds with a doctor's precision. The voice that was rough, but not cruel, unused to conversation but not hostile to it. The cabin that was spare but clean, organized with the care of someone who valued order. None of it, she said quietly. I don't believe any of it. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. You're the first in 3 years to say so. I'm also the first they sent up here to die. She pulled the blanket higher, suddenly aware of the cold seeping in around the window frame. Maybe that makes my opinion less valuable. Or more. He rose again, restless energy finding outlet in small tasks. He checked the water pitcher, adjusted the damper on the stove, straightened items that were already straight. The people who matter most are usually the ones with the least power. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a deep bass note that vibrated through the cabin's foundation. Rowan moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Storm's close. We'll be locked in by morning. Panic fluttered in Lydia's chest. Locked in. Trapped with a stranger, no escape, no witnesses. Every instinct screamed danger, but when she looked at Rowan's profile against the window, all she saw was a man watching weather patterns with a practiced eye. I won't hurt you. He said it without turning, as if he'd heard her fear in the quality of her silence. Whatever they told you about me, whatever you're imagining, I won't hurt you. You don't know what I'm imagining, don't I? Now he did turn, and his eyes were impossibly sad. You're imagining every way this could go wrong, every reason not to trust me, every exit you don't have. He moved back to his chair, settling with a sigh. You're imagining that I'm the monster they say I am, and you're trying to figure out if you're strong enough to fight or if you should just accept whatever comes. The accuracy stole her breath. How? Because that's what I would imagine in your position. He picked up his book again, not opening it, just holding it like a talisman. You've been hurt, badly, by people who should have protected you. Why would you trust a stranger, especially one with my reputation? Then why tell me not to be afraid? Because fear is exhausting, and you need to heal. He finally opened the book, finding his page. And because whether you believe it or not, you're safe here, safer than you've been in a long time. The fire crackled. Wind began to rise outside, making the pines whisper and sway. And Lydia found herself doing something she hadn't done in 2 years. She believed someone. Not completely. Not with the blind faith of a child. But enough to let her shoulders ease, enough to sink back into the pillows, enough to close her eyes without the certain knowledge that opening them again might be impossible. When she woke, full darkness had fallen. The cabin was lit only by firelight, casting dancing shadows across the rough-timbered walls. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was, only that something was different. The air smelled of pine instead of grease. The surface beneath her was soft instead of scratching burlap, and the sound reaching her ears was wind in trees rather than drunken voices from the taproom. Then memory returned, and with it a spike of adrenaline that made her ribs ache. The mountain, the beast. Except, easy. Rowan's voice came from somewhere in the shadows. You're safe. Just the storm. As if to punctuate his words, rain began hammering against the roof. Not the gentle patter of a spring shower, but the driving assault of a serious storm. The kind that could strip leaves from trees and turn trails into rivers of mud. She pushed herself up carefully, wincing as her damaged ribs protested. The cabin resolved into clearer detail as her eyes adjusted. Rowan sat at a small table near the far wall, working by lamplight on something she couldn't quite see. His movements were precise, methodical, the concentration of someone lost in familiar work. What are you doing? Preparing medicines. He didn't look up, his hands steady as he measured dried herbs into a small cloth bag. Winter's coming. I'll need supplies. Do you treat people up here? Sometimes. A shrug, still focused on his work. Hunters who misjudge the weather. Trappers who get careless with their knives. The occasional fool who thinks climbing a mountain in November is a good idea. He tied off the bag with practiced efficiency. They don't come to me directly. They'd rather die than seek help from the monster. But they leave signs. Blood on rocks, broken equipment, tracks leading nowhere good. I find them, patch them up, leave them somewhere they'll be found by their own people. You save them, and they never know. Better that way. They get to live. I don't have to listen to their fear. He finally looked up, his face half-shadowed by the lamp. Everyone wins. Lydia swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing her strength. The room swayed slightly, but steadied. I need to... Is there a... Outhouse is 20 feet due west. I'll get you there. I can manage. You can barely stand. He was already moving, crossing the small space with economical steps. Save your pride for when you're healed enough to defend it. He wrapped a heavy coat around her shoulders. His own, she realized, the wool still warm from where it had been hanging near the fire. Then he opened the door and the storm roared in, all wind and rain and violent cold. The 20 feet to the outhouse felt like 20 miles. Rowan kept one arm around her waist, supporting most of her weight, his body blocking the worst of the wind. Rain soaked through her nightshirt in seconds, plastering the fabric to her skin, but the coat kept her core warm. He waited outside the outhouse, a dark shape barely visible through the downpour. When she emerged, he guided her back to the cabin with the same steady care, neither rushing nor lingering. Inside, he handed her a towel and turned his back while she dried off and climbed back into bed. Thank you, she said to his back. No need. He was adding wood to the fire, building it up against the cold the open door had let in. Storm like this, we help each other or we die. That's just mountain logic. She wanted to argue that it was more than logic, that his kindness went beyond simple survival necessity. But exhaustion was pulling at her again, the brief exertion having drained what little strength she'd recovered. Sleep, Rowan said, as if reading her thoughts. Morning's a long way off. She did, falling into darkness like a stone into deep water. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Lydia would wake to find Rowan already up, the fire built high, something cooking on the stove. He'd bring her breakfast, porridge with honey, eggs from chickens she could hear but not see, bread toasted over the fire. Then he'd disappear outside for hours, tending to whatever tasks kept a man alive in the wilderness. She used the solitude to explore the cabin, moving carefully at first, then with increasing confidence as her ribs began to heal. It was larger than it had seemed that first night. One main room that served as kitchen, living space, and medical workspace, plus a smaller room where Rowan slept when she was in the main bed. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by the same hands that had built the cabin. Everything had a place, everything served a purpose. Nothing was wasted. The medical supplies fascinated her. Shelves lined with bottles and jars, each one labeled in neat script. Mortar and pestle, scalpels arranged by size, bandages rolled and ready. A whole apothecary's worth of equipment maintained with the care of someone who still thought of himself as a doctor, even if the world had decided otherwise. Books, too. Medical texts, but also philosophy, poetry, natural history. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles she'd never heard of, subjects she'd never imagined. Evidence of a mind that needed feeding as much as the body did. On the third day, Rowan came in from the storm with an armload of wood and found her standing at the shelves, a book of anatomical drawings open in her hands. "Can you read?" He sounded more curious than surprised. "My mother taught me." Lydia closed the book carefully, returning it to its exact position. "Before she died." "You can borrow them if you want. They're not doing anyone any good gathering dust." He stacked the wood beside the fireplace, brushing bark fragments from his shirt. "Do you like to read?" "I don't know. I haven't had time in years." The admission hurt more than she expected. At the crossroads, there was always work, always something that needed doing. "Well, there's work here too." He straightened, rolling his shoulders. "But there's also time. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. Might as well use the hours for something better than staring at walls." That night, after supper, Lydia settled into the chair by the fire with a book of poems while Rowan worked on his medicines. The only sounds were the storm's rage outside, the fire's gentle crackle, the occasional scrape of mortar against pestle. It was the most peaceful evening she could remember. "Read one aloud," Rowan said eventually, not looking up from his work. "What?" "A poem. Read one aloud." He measured something into a small bottle, corked it. "It's been 3 years since I heard anything but my own voice in the wind. I'd like to hear words someone else chose." So she read, haltingly at first, self-conscious about her voice, then with growing confidence as she lost herself in the rhythm. The poem was about seasons changing, about winter's harshness giving way to spring's promise. When she finished, silence filled the cabin like water finding its level. "Beautiful," Rowan said quietly. "Thank you." Over the following days, it became their evening ritual. Supper, then reading, then the comfortable quiet of two people who'd learned they didn't need to fill every silence with noise. Lydia discovered she liked his presence, the solid certainty of him, the way he moved through space with careful awareness of his own strength, the rare moments when something she read made him smile. On the 5th day, the storm broke. Lydia woke to sunshine streaming through the window and Rowan already at the door, eager to assess the damage. "Come see," he called, and she joined him in the doorway. The world had been transformed. Snow covered everything, not the deep drifts of true winter yet, but a thick blanket that softened edges and muffled sound. The clearing sparkled like something from a fairy tale, and the sky above was so blue it hurt to look at directly. "First snow?" Rowan said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice. "Always feels like a new start." Lydia stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet immediately registering the cold of the wooden planks. But the air was so clean it made her dizzy, crisp and sharp, and free of smoke and grease and human waste. "It's beautiful. It's deadly if you're not careful." He pointed to where the trail disappeared into unmarked white. 6 feet of snow up here by January, no way down until spring thaw. The implication settled over her like the snow on the pines. "I'd be trapped here." "We'd both be trapped here." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Which is why we need to decide now. Do you want to go back down before the next storm, or are you staying until spring?" "Go back to what?" The words came out harder than she intended. "Cutler made it clear I'm not welcome. And even if I went somewhere else, what would I do? I have no money, no references, no skills, except cooking for people who treat me like dirt." "You have more skills than you think." Rowan stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. "You can read and write. You can endure pain without breaking. You can walk 3 miles on cracked ribs because giving up wasn't in you. He turned back to face her. Those are rare skills, Lydia. Rarer than you know. They won't keep me fed. No, but I will. If you stay. He said it simply, the same tone he used for discussing weather or medical procedures. I could use help. Someone to tend the chickens, preserve food for winter, keep the cabin while I'm hunting. In exchange, you get a roof, meals, safety. No beatings, no humiliation, no payment for ruined dresses. Why? She needed to understand. Why would you do that for a stranger? Because I remember what it's like. He looked past her, toward the mountains rising in the distance. Being cast out, being judged for something that wasn't your fault, having nowhere to go and no one who gave a damn if you lived or died. His eyes returned to hers, and the pain in them was old but still raw. I can't fix what happened to you, but I can give you a choice. Stay or go. Either way, no judgment. The offer hung between them, fragile as frost on glass. A choice, something she hadn't been given in longer than she could remember. Not a rescue, not charity, but a practical arrangement between two people the world had decided to discard. I want to stay, she heard herself say. If you'll have me. Something that might have been relief crossed his face. Then we'd better get you properly equipped. Can't have you walking around in a nightshirt all winter. He showed her the fabric he'd mentioned, wool and linen stored in a trunk, alongside needles and thread. Together they measured and cut, his hands surprisingly deft for their size, her stitching skills rusty but serviceable. By evening she had a simple dress that fit, warm stockings, and a promise of boots to be fashioned from leather he had curing in the shed. Thank you, she said, running her hands over the wool. I'll work hard. I'll earn this. You already have. He was at the stove, stirring something that smelled of rosemary and thyme. You've given me someone to talk to besides myself. That's payment enough. They fell into new rhythms after that. Lydia took over the cooking, discovering that Rowan's supplies were better than anything she'd had at the crossroads. He hunted, and she transformed his kills into meals that made him pause mid-bite to look at her with something like wonder. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mother. She said food was love made visible. Lydia stirred the pot, adjusted the seasoning. At the inn, I cooked to avoid getting hit. This is the first time in 2 years I've cooked because I wanted to. It shows. She learned the rhythms of his days, up at dawn, checking traps before breakfast, tending the small garden he'd managed to coax from the rocky soil, hunting when supplies ran low, always working with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that survival required constant effort. He taught her to care for the chickens, to read weather signs in the clouds, to distinguish between animal tracks in the snow. She taught him that conversation didn't have to be an interrogation, that laughter was allowed even in exile, that comfort could be found in shared silence. 2 weeks after her arrival, Lydia woke to find Rowan standing at the window, his posture rigid with tension. What's wrong? Smoke, he pointed toward the valley, coming from the direction of the lower trail. Someone's camping close to the mountain. Hunters? Wrong season. Wrong location. His jaw tightened. And they're burning green wood. See how thick the smoke is? Either they're idiots or they want to be found. By you? Maybe. He moved away from the window, began gathering supplies with grim efficiency. Medical kit, rope, blankets. Stay here. Bar the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone but me. Rowan, someone's in trouble or someone's coming for you. He met her eyes, his expression harder than she'd seen it. Either way, I need to know you're safe while I find out which. He was gone before she could argue, disappearing into the forest like smoke himself. Lydia barred the door as instructed, then moved to the window to watch the plume rising in the distance. The hours crawled past. She tried to read, to cook, to occupy herself with small tasks, but her attention kept returning to the window. The smoke continued, thick and dark against the pale sky. When sunset began painting the snow in shades of orange and gold, she heard voices. Men's voices, rough and angry, coming up the trail toward the cabin. Then Rowan's voice, calm and cold. That's far enough. Lydia moved to the window, peering out carefully. 3 men stood at the edge of the clearing, and even from this distance she recognized the one in front, Samuel Garrett, from the Crossroads Inn. "We don't want trouble, Blackwood." Garrett's hands were raised, showing empty palms. "We just came for the girl." "What girl?" Rowan stood between them and the cabin, and though he held no weapon, something in his stillness suggested violence coiled and ready. "The one Cutler left with you, Lydia Hale." Garrett took a step forward. Rowan matched it, maintaining the distance. "She's wanted back in town." "For what?" "That's between her and the innkeeper." Funny thing about that. Rowan's voice never rose, never hardened, but the threat in it was unmistakable. The innkeeper beat her, bound her, and abandoned her on a mountain trail. That tells me anything between them is finished. You don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly. Now Rowan did move, closing the distance in 3 long strides. Garrett stumbled backward. "You came up here thinking I'm the monster they say I am, thinking I'd just hand over a woman because you asked nicely. But here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to turn around, walk back down this mountain, and tell Cutler that Lydia Hale is under my protection now. You can't just keep her." "I'm not keeping her. She's choosing to stay. There's a difference." One of the other men spoke up, younger than Garrett, emboldened by numbers. "What if we decide to take her anyway?" Rowan looked at him, really looked at him, and the young man went pale. "Then you'll learn exactly why people tell stories about me. And I promise you won't enjoy the lesson." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Garrett found his voice first. "Cutler's not going to let this go." "Then Cutler can come himself." Rowan gestured toward the darkening forest. "Now get off my mountain before I change my mind about letting you leave." They went, scrambling down the trail like rabbits fleeing a wolf. Rowan watched until they disappeared from sight, then turned toward the cabin. Lydia opened the door before he could knock. "You heard." Not a question. "Every word?" She stepped aside to let him enter, her heart still racing from the confrontation. "You shouldn't have done that." "Why not?" "Because now they'll come back, with more men, or the law, or—" "Let them come." He shed his coat, hung it carefully on its peg. "You said you wanted to stay. That means I protect you. That's how this works." "But I'm not worth—" "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. He turned to face her, and his eyes were blazing. "Don't tell me what you're worth. They've been telling you that for years, and every word was a lie. You're worth protection. You're worth safety. You're worth fighting for. And if Cutler or anyone else wants to debate that point, they can take it up with me." Tears blurred her vision, sudden and hot. "Why do you care so much?" "Because someone should have cared sooner." He moved past her to the fire, his movements sharp with residual anger. "Because I know what it's like to be declared worthless by people too small to see value. Because you walked 3 miles on broken ribs and didn't give up, and that means something." Lydia sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the fierce certainty in his voice. No one had ever defended her like this. No one had ever suggested she deserved defending. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." He settled into his own chair, the anger draining away to leave exhaustion in its wake. "This isn't over. Garrett was just the first wave. But whatever comes next, we'll face it. Together." Outside, full darkness had fallen. The temperature was dropping, promising another storm before morning. And in the small cabin on Blackwood Mountain, 2 outcasts sat by the fire and prepared for battle. The battle arrived 5 days later, though not in the form either of them expected. Lydia was feeding the chickens when she heard horses on the trail, not the furtive approach of men trying to avoid detection, but the deliberate pace of riders who had every right to be there. She dropped the feed bucket and ran for the cabin, her boots slipping on ice that had formed overnight. "Rowan!" He emerged from the shed where he'd been splitting wood, axe still in hand. His eyes went to the trail, tracking the sound, and his expression hardened into something unreadable. "Get inside, stay away from the windows." "How many?" "At least 4 horses, maybe more." He set the axe against the cabin wall within easy reach. "This isn't Garrett coming back for another try. This is official." Lydia's stomach clenched. Official meant the law, meant authority she couldn't fight, meant the kind of power that could drag her back to the crossroads, or worse. She pressed herself against the cabin's interior wall, heart hammering, as the horses crested the rise and came into view. 6 riders. 5 men and 1 woman, all dressed in town clothes that looked absurdly formal against the mountain's wild backdrop. At the front rode a man in his 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and a badge pinned to his heavy coat, the territorial marshal, she realized with growing dread. Beside him rode Gerald Cutler, looking smug and vindicated. And beside Cutler, wrapped in furs that probably cost more than Lydia had earned in her entire life, sat Mrs. Eleanor Crawford. Rowan stood in the center of the clearing, utterly still, watching them approach. He'd positioned himself so they'd have to go through him to reach the cabin door, and the message was clear. Whatever they wanted, they'd have to negotiate for it. The marshal raised a hand and the group halted at the clearing's edge. "Dr. Blackwood, I'm Marshal Thomas Weaver. We need to discuss a serious matter." "Then discuss it from there," Rowan's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "You're on my land. That gives me the right to set terms." "Fair enough." Weaver dismounted slowly, hands visible, making no sudden moves. "I'm here about Miss Lydia Hale. These folks claim you're holding her against her will." "These folks are liars." Cutler's face flushed red. "Now see here." "Quiet, Gerald." Weaver silenced him with a look, then turned back to Rowan. "I'd like to hear from Miss Hale herself, if that's acceptable." Rowan's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "Lydia, come out here." She forced herself to move, though everything in her screamed to hide. The cabin door swung open and she stepped onto the porch, lifting her chin despite the fear clawing at her throat. 6 pairs of eyes fixed on her immediately, assessing, judging. Mrs. Crawford gasped audibly. "Good heavens, what has he done to you?" Lydia touched her face reflexively. The bruises had faded from purple to yellow-green. The split lip had healed to a thin scab, but the damage was still visible. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd been beaten badly and was still recovering. "Dr. Blackwood didn't do this." Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "This happened before I came to the mountain." "Before?" Weaver's eyes sharpened. "Who did it then?" She looked directly at Cutler. "The innkeeper. When I ruined Mrs. Crawford's dress, he beat me with an iron poker, tied me up, and left me on the mountain trail to die. Dr. Blackwood found me and saved my life." "That's a damned lie!" Cutler spurred his horse forward a few steps. "I brought her up here because she asked to come, because she'd heard Dr. Blackwood needed help. You're calling her a liar?" Rowan's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Interesting strategy, considering I still have the ropes you used. They've got her blood on them." Weaver held up a hand. "Miss Hale, are you here of your own free will?" "Yes." "Has Dr. Blackwood harmed you in any way, threatened you, or forced you to remain?" "No, he's shown me nothing but kindness." She met the marshal's eyes steadily. "I'm staying because I choose to stay." She doesn't know what she's saying. This from Mrs. Crawford, her voice dripping with false concern. The poor girl is clearly traumatized, possibly suffering from some kind of mountain fever. She needs proper care, not... She gestured vaguely at the cabin, at Rowan, at the wilderness itself. "Not this. I'm not suffering from anything except the memory of your cruelty." Lydia descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately, until she stood beside Rowan. "You're the reason I'm here, Mrs. Crawford. You and your expensive dress and your need to see someone punished for an accident. You got your punishment. I was beaten and abandoned. Is that not enough for you?" The woman's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Color rose in her cheeks. Embarrassment or anger, Lydia couldn't tell and didn't care. "This is ridiculous." Cutler's horse stamped nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. "Marshal, I have rights here. She was in my employ. She destroyed valuable property. She owes me. She owes you nothing." Rowan's hand moved to Lydia's shoulder, not possessive, but protective. "You forfeited any claim when you tied her up and left her to freeze." "That's attempted murder, Cutler, and you did it in front of witnesses. Witnesses who'll swear I was defending my business." Samuel Garrett already told me the truth. Rowan's smile was cold. "When I sent him running down the mountain, he was quite forthcoming about what happened that night." Weaver was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone sorting truth from lies. "Dr. Blackwood, may I examine Miss Hale's injuries?" "If she agrees to it." The marshal looked at Lydia. "Miss Hale?" She nodded, though her skin crawled at the thought of being touched by yet another stranger. But Weaver was professional, his examination quick and impersonal. He noted the faded bruises, the way she flinched when he pressed gently on her left side, the scars on her wrists from the ropes. "These are consistent with a severe beating," he said finally, stepping back. "And the rope burns are recent. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. "She could have gotten those anywhere," Mrs. Crawford protested. "Could have." Weaver's tone made clear he didn't believe it. "But paired with Mr. Garrett's statement and the evidence Dr. Blackwood claims to have, I'm inclined to believe Miss Hale's account." He turned to Cutler. "Gerald, I strongly suggest you let this matter drop." "Let it drop? She owes me for that dress." "Then take it up in civil court. But I warn you, if you do, I'll be testifying about these injuries, and I doubt a judge will look kindly on a man who beats women." Weaver mounted his horse with the ease of long practice. "As for you, Dr. Blackwood, I'll be keeping an eye on this situation. If Miss Hale's circumstances change, if she wants to leave, my door is open." "Understood." Rowan's posture didn't relax. "Though you might want to keep a closer eye on what happens in town rather than what happens on my mountain." It was a pointed rebuke, and Weaver had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Fair point. Miss Hale, you're certain this is what you want?" "It is." "Then I wish you well." He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "Wait." Mrs. Crawford urged her horse forward, her expression shifting to something almost pleading. "Miss Hale, surely you can see this isn't proper. An unmarried woman living alone with a man in the wilderness? Think of your reputation." Lydia almost laughed. "My reputation? Mrs. Crawford, my reputation was destroyed the moment your dress got wet. I was the fat, clumsy cook who couldn't do anything right. Now I'm the woman who chose dignity over degradation. I'll take the second version, thank you." "But what kind of life can you have here? No society, no culture, no prospects for marriage?" "I had all those things in town." Lydia's voice hardened. "Society meant being mocked daily. Culture meant serving people who treated me like furniture. And marriage prospects." She shook her head. "No man in that town would have me, and we both know it. At least here, I'm valued for what I can do, not judged for what I look like." Something flickered in Mrs. Crawford's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or shame. For a moment, Lydia thought she might actually apologize. Then the woman's expression shuddered, and she turned her horse away. "This is madness. Marshal, I insist you do something." "I've done what the law allows, ma'am." Weaver tipped his hat to Lydia. "The lady has spoken. That's the end of it." The group turned their horses and began the descent, Cutler shooting venomous looks over his shoulder until the trees swallowed him from view. Only when the last sound of hoofbeats had faded did Rowan finally move, his shoulders dropping as tension bled away. "That went better than expected," he said quietly. "Did it?" Lydia found she was shaking, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation now leaving her hollow. "They'll be back, or others will come. This isn't over." "Maybe not." He guided her back toward the cabin, his hand steady on her elbow. "But you faced them down. You told the truth. That matters." Inside, she collapsed into a chair, the shaking intensifying. Rowan moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire, preparing tea, giving her space to process what had just happened. "I called her cruel," she said when he handed her a steaming cup. To her face, "I've never done anything like that before." "How did it feel?" "Terrifying, liberating." She wrapped her hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. "Like jumping off a cliff and discovering I could fly." "Good." He settled into his own chair, cradling his tea. "You should feel that more often. The world's been telling you to be small for too long." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire consume the wood in slow, inexorable increments. Outside, clouds were gathering again, promising more snow. The mountain was preparing for true winter, the season when the world contracted to just what you could reach, just who you were with, just what you'd built to survive. "Rowan?" She set her cup aside. "Why did you really leave Denver?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. I told you about the girl who died. What I didn't tell you was that I loved her father. Not romantically. Daniel was my closest friend. We'd studied medicine together, opened practices across the street from each other, stood up at each other's weddings. When his daughter got sick, he brought her to me because he trusted me more than he trusted himself. Rowan's hands tightened on his cup. I worked on her for 3 days straight, tried everything I knew, everything I could think of, but she had meningitis, and this was before we had real treatments for it. All I could do was ease her suffering and watch her die. That wasn't your fault. I know, rationally, I know. He set his cup down with careful precision. But Daniel couldn't accept it. His daughter was dead, and someone had to be responsible. So he convinced himself that I'd made mistakes, that I'd been negligent, that if I'd just done something different, she'd still be alive. He destroyed you to avoid his own guilt. He destroyed me because grief makes monsters of us all. Rowan stood, moving to the window. The accusations, the investigation, the trial. I could have survived all of that. What I couldn't survive was losing my friend. Daniel testified against me, swore under oath that I'd been drinking, that I'd been careless, that I'd killed his daughter through incompetence. But you were cleared. Legally, yes. The medical board reviewed every decision I'd made, every treatment I'd attempted. They found no fault. But by then it didn't matter. Patients stopped coming. Other doctors wouldn't refer to me. Daniel's lies had done their work, and clearing my name didn't undo the damage. He turned from the window, and the grief in his eyes was fresh as new snow. So I came here, built this cabin with my own hands, every log and board and shingle, taught myself to live without the medicine I'd spent my life mastering. And I told myself it was enough, that solitude was better than society, that exile was preferable to fighting. Until I showed up. Until you showed up. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Beaten, broken, left to die. And suddenly exile didn't feel noble anymore. It felt like cowardice. Lydia crossed to stand beside him at the window. Below them, the valley stretched away in whites and grays, the town invisible in the distance but present nonetheless. A reminder that the world existed beyond this mountain with all its cruelty and grace. You're not a coward, she said firmly. You're a man who was hurt badly and needed time to heal. There's no shame in that, isn't there? He looked at her, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, raw and aching. I abandoned medicine. I let fear drive me away from the work I loved. And I've spent 3 years telling myself it was principle, when really it was just pain. So what do you do now? I don't know. He turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. The marshal will talk. People will start to wonder about the monster on the mountain who took in a beaten woman and stood up to the town. Some will make it into something ugly, but some, he paused, some might remember that I used to be a doctor, that I used to help people. Would you want to go back? To Denver? To medicine? No, never Denver. The answer was immediate, certain. But medicine? He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Part of me thinks that ship has sailed. Another part wonders if maybe there's a different way to practice. Here, on the mountain, for people who need help but can't afford town doctors or won't trust them. You already do that. You said you patch up hunters and trappers. Secretly, anonymously, not the same as really practicing. He rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line. This is foolish talk. No one would come to the beast for treatment. I did. You didn't have a choice. I had a choice every day after the first one, and I chose to stay. She touched his arm, waiting until he looked at her. You're a good man, Rowan Blackwood. A good doctor. If you wanted to practice again, even just for the people this mountain draws, I think you should. And who would trust me enough to come? I would. The words emerged with absolute conviction. I'd tell anyone who asked that you saved my life, treated me with respect, and gave me a home when I had nothing. That's worth more than all of Daniel's lies combined. Something shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe, fragile but present. Before he could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Not horses this time, but something else. Something smaller, desperate. Rowan was moving before Lydia could ask, grabbing his medical kit and coat in one smooth motion. She followed him onto the porch and saw what had caught his attention. A figure stumbling through the snow at the tree line, moving erratically, clearly in distress. "Stay here." Rowan was already running, his long strides eating up the distance. Lydia watched him reach the figure. A man, she could see now, younger than Rowan, dressed inadequately for the weather. He collapsed into Rowan's arms, and even from the porch she could see the dark stain spreading across the snow beneath them. Blood. Rowan half carried, half dragged the man to the cabin. Up close, Lydia could see he was barely out of his teens, his face gray with shock and pain. And protruding from his thigh was an arrow, the shaft broken off short, but the head still embedded deep in muscle. "Hunting accident," the young man gasped as Rowan lowered him onto the bed. "My brother, he didn't see me. The arrow—" "Shh. Save your strength." Rowan was already cutting away the blood-soaked trousers, exposing the wound. "Lydia, I need clean cloth, hot water, and my surgical kit, the one with the forceps and probes." She moved without thinking, muscle memory from watching him work taking over. Within minutes, she had everything assembled, had stoked the fire to heat more water, had even laid out the instruments in the order he'd need them. Rowan glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You've been watching." "I've been learning." She poured hot water into a basin. "Tell me what to do." What followed was the longest hour of Lydia's life. Rowan worked with absolute concentration, his hands steady as he probed the wound, located the arrowhead, and began the delicate process of extraction. He talked her through each step: when to apply pressure, how to hand him instruments, where to hold the lamp for better light. "The arrow nicked the artery," he murmured, more to himself than her. "Not severed, thank God, but damaged. I need to repair it before he bleeds out." The young man had passed out from pain, which Rowan said was actually helpful. Unconscious patients didn't thrash. Lydia watched him work with something approaching awe. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd given up, what he clearly still loved with every fiber of his being. His hands moved with absolute certainty, finding vessels, tying off bleeders, stitching torn tissue with an artist's precision. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably less than an hour, he sat back. Done. He'll live if infection doesn't set in. "Lydia, can you bandage while I clean up?" She did, following the technique she'd seen him use on her own injuries weeks ago. The young man was already looking better, color returning to his face, his breathing steadier. "Where did you learn to assist like that?" Rowan asked as he scrubbed blood from his hands. "Watching you. Reading your books." She secured the bandage with careful precision. "I thought, if I'm going to live on a mountain, I should probably know something about medicine. People get hurt up here." "They do." He dried his hands, studying her with new appreciation. "You're a natural. Ever think about becoming a nurse? Women can do that?" "In some places, yes. It's still rare, but it's starting to happen." He glanced at the unconscious young man. "You have the temperament for it. Steady hands, calm under pressure, good instincts." Before Lydia could respond, voices erupted from outside, men's voices, panicked and calling. Rowan opened the door to find 3 hunters scrambling into the clearing, their faces wild with fear. "Please, my brother, he was shot." The speaker was older than the patient, but shared the same sharp features. "We tracked his blood here. We didn't know where else." He stopped, seeing Rowan, and terror flooded his expression. "Oh God, we came to the monster. Your brother is alive." Rowan's voice cut through the panic. "Come inside, carefully." They filed in, these rough mountain men reduced to trembling boys by fear and hope. The oldest one, the brother, rushed to the bedside, taking in the clean bandages, the steady breathing. "You saved him." "I'm a doctor. It's what I do." Rowan was already giving instructions. "He needs to stay still for at least 3 days. The wound needs to be kept clean and dry. Change the bandages twice daily using boiled water. If you see red streaks spreading from the wound, or if he develops fever, bring him back immediately." "Bring him back. Here?" The brother looked between Rowan and his patient. "To you?" "Unless you'd prefer to let him die to avoid the monster." There was no heat in Rowan's words, just tired resignation. No. The man swallowed hard. I'm sorry, for thinking, for believing. He couldn't finish the sentence. Just take care of your brother. Rowan moved to the door. And tell people what you saw here today. The truth, not the stories. They left an hour later, carrying their brother on a makeshift litter, profuse in their gratitude. Rowan watched them go with an expression Lydia couldn't quite read. That's twice now, she said, coming to stand beside him. Twice you've helped people who thought you were a monster. Word will spread. He sounded almost afraid of it. They'll start to wonder, to question the stories. Is that so bad? I don't know. He closed the door against the cold. For 3 years I've been alone, safe in my exile, untouched by the world. But now you're here, and people keep showing up, and I'm starting to remember what it was like to be needed. And I'm not sure I can go back to being alone. He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. You've ruined me for solitude, Lydia Hale. She wanted to tell him he'd ruined her too, ruined her for accepting cruelty, for believing she deserved less, for thinking safety meant hiding. But before she could find the words, he was moving away, busying himself with cleaning the medical instruments, retreating into familiar tasks. That night they sat by the fire as usual, but the silence felt different, charged with possibility, heavy with things unsaid. Lydia tried to read, but the words wouldn't focus. Rowan pretended to work on his medicines, but his movements were distracted, his attention elsewhere. Finally, he spoke. If more people come, for treatment, I'll need help, real help, not just handing me instruments in an emergency. I want to learn. It's not easy work. There's blood, pain, sometimes death, despite our best efforts. I know. She set her book aside. I watched my mother die. I held her hand while fever took her, helpless to do anything but bear witness. If I can learn to help, to actually make a difference when someone's suffering. Her voice cracked. I want that. I need that. Rowan nodded slowly. Then I'll teach you, starting tomorrow. We'll begin with basics, anatomy, wound care, recognizing infection. If you prove capable, we'll move to more complex procedures. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm a demanding teacher. Good, she smiled despite the tears threatening. I'm a demanding student. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and soft, covering the world in fresh whiteness. Inside the cabin, 2 outcasts made plans for a future neither had expected to have. And on the mountain, something new was beginning to grow. Not romance, not yet, but partnership, trust, the slow, careful building of something that might, given time, become unshakable. The next morning brought chaos in the form of 5 riders thundering into the clearing, led by Gerald Cutler and backed by men Lydia recognized from the crossroads, rough types who worked as bouncers and enforcers, men who enjoyed violence and didn't ask questions. Rowan stepped onto the porch, and this time he held a rifle. That's far enough, Cutler. The marshal might have believed your lies, Blackwood, but I know the truth. Cutler's face was mottled with rage. You've got my property, and I'm taking her back. Your property? Rowan's voice was deadly quiet. Say that again. She owes me for damages. That makes her mine until the debt is paid. That's not how debt works. This new voice came from behind Cutler, and everyone turned to see Marshal Weaver riding into the clearing, his own weapon drawn. That's called slavery, Gerald, and it's been illegal for a while now. Marshal, I told you to let it go. You didn't listen. Weaver positioned his horse between Cutler and the cabin. Now you're trespassing on private property with what looks like intent to commit violence. That's a crime I can arrest you for. Cutler's hand moved toward his own weapon. Rowan's rifle came up smoothly, and the click of the hammer cocking was loud in the sudden silence. Don't! One word, but it carried absolute conviction. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cutler's hand dropped away from his gun, and something in his posture collapsed. This isn't over, he spat, but the words had no force behind them. Actually, it is. Weaver gestured toward the trail. You're done here, Gerald, and if I hear about you harassing Dr. Blackwood or Miss Hale again, I'll arrest you myself. Now get off this mountain before I change my mind about being lenient. They left, Cutler's fury a palpable thing even as distance swallowed the group. Weaver remained behind, dismounting with a sigh. I apologize for that. Some men don't know when they're beaten. You didn't have to come, Rowan said, lowering the rifle. Actually, I did. Young man came into town last night, told a story about the doctor on Blackwood Mountain saving his brother's life. Got me thinking that maybe I'd been listening to the wrong stories all along. Weaver looked at Rowan directly. You really a doctor? I was. Still am, I suppose. Then maybe it's time people knew that. Time the real story replaced the made-up ones. He tipped his hat to Lydia. Miss Hale, you take care. And Dr. Blackwood, if you're serious about practicing again, even just up here, come see me. Might be we can work something out. He rode away, leaving Rowan and Lydia standing in the snow, staring at each other with dawning realization. Did that just happen? Lydia asked. I think it did. Rowan set the rifle aside, and for the first time since she'd met him, he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. The world's gone mad. Or maybe, Lydia said, moving to stand beside him, maybe it's finally going sane. On the mountain, snow continued to fall. In the valley, stories were changing. And in a small cabin built from exile and loneliness, two people stood together and looked toward a future neither had thought possible. The worst wasn't over yet. But for the first time, neither of them was facing it alone. The change started small, the way avalanches begin with a single shifted stone. 3 days after Marshal Weaver's visit, a trapper appeared at the cabin door with a gash across his forearm that needed stitching. He was nervous, kept his eyes on the floor while Rowan worked, but he came. And he paid, not with money, which neither he nor Rowan had much of, but with a brace of rabbits and information about game trails that would make winter hunting easier. My wife thanks you, he said as he left, the words coming out stilted, unpracticed. She was afraid I'd lose the arm. Tell her to keep it clean, Rowan replied, and Lydia heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Satisfaction, purpose, the quiet pleasure of being useful again. 2 days later, a woman arrived with her daughter, who had a fever that wouldn't break. Rowan examined the girl carefully while Lydia prepared willow bark tea, moving through the cabin with the easy coordination they'd developed over weeks of living in close quarters. It's just a bad cold, Rowan pronounced finally, but it could turn into something worse if she's not careful. Keep her warm, make sure she drinks plenty of fluids, and if the fever spikes above what it is now, come back immediately. The woman pressed a small cloth bag into Lydia's hands as they left. Inside were dried beans, precious in the high country, and a note written in careful script. Thank you for your kindness. They're starting to trust you, Lydia said that evening, sorting the beans into their storage jar. They're desperate. Rowan was at his table, updating the medical journal he'd started keeping again, notes on each patient, each treatment, each outcome. The nearest doctor is 2 days' ride in good weather. In winter, it might as well be the moon. They come to me because they have no choice. You don't believe that, don't I? He set down his pen, rubbed his eyes. The woman today, did you see how she positioned herself between me and her daughter the whole time? How she watched my hands like she expected me to hurt the girl? I also saw how she relaxed when you were gentle, how she smiled when you made her daughter laugh. Lydia moved to stand behind his chair, reading over his shoulder. His handwriting was precise, methodical, each observation detailed and exact. You're building something here, Rowan. They might come out of desperation the first time, but they'll come back because you're good at what you do. We'll see. But he didn't sound convinced. The next week brought a snowstorm that lasted 4 days, trapping them inside with nothing but each other for company. Lydia had worried the enforced proximity might breed tension, but instead they fell into rhythms that felt ancient, inevitable. She cooked while he read aloud from medical texts, explaining procedures and theories in language she could understand. He maintained the fire while she practiced suturing on pieces of leather, her stitches growing smaller and more precise with each attempt. You're getting good at that, he observed, watching her work. I have a good teacher. She tied off the final stitch, examined her work critically. Though I doubt leather bleeds the way skin does. No, but the principle is the same. Neat, even stitches, proper tension, secure knots. He took the leather from her, testing the stitches with gentle pressure. This would hold. When the next patient comes who needs suturing, you'll assist. Actually, assist, not just hand me instruments. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, excitement flickered in her chest. The same feeling she'd had watching him save that young hunter's life. The sense that here was work worth doing, skills worth learning. "What made you want to be a doctor?" she asked, setting aside her practice piece. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My sister," he said finally. "She got scarlet fever when she was 6. The local doctor did what he could, but it wasn't enough. She died screaming, begging someone to make it stop hurting, and all I could do was hold her hand and feel useless." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I was 12 years old, and I swore that day I'd never be that helpless again. That I'd learn how to fix people, how to ease suffering, how to fight death instead of just watching it win." Did it help? Learning all that? Sometimes. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Sometimes I could save them. Sometimes I could ease their pain, buy them more time, give their families hope. And sometimes the smile faded. Sometimes death won anyway, and all my knowledge meant nothing. That's the part they don't tell you when you're studying, that no matter how good you get, you'll still lose patience. You'll still watch people die despite your best efforts. Like Daniel's daughter. Like Daniel's daughter. He stood abruptly, moved to the window. Snow was still falling, thick and relentless, building drifts that would take days to melt. I couldn't save her. No one could have. But Daniel needed someone to blame, and I was convenient. Easier to hate me than to accept that sometimes we're powerless. Lydia joined him at the window, their reflections ghostly in the dark glass. "Do you hate him for what he did to you?" "I did. For a long time, hate was all I had. It kept me warm those first winters, gave me something to focus on besides loneliness." He turned to look at her, and his expression was unbearably sad. "But hate's exhausting. Eventually, I just felt empty, like he'd taken everything that mattered and left me hollow. And now? Now I don't know what I feel." He looked back out at the snow. "Part of me wants him to know I'm practicing again, wants him to see that his lies didn't destroy me. Another part thinks the best revenge is building a good life and never giving him another thought. Both can be true. Can they?" "I think so." She hesitated, then forged ahead. "I spent 2 years at the crossroads thinking about all the ways I could make Cutler pay for how he treated me. But when he showed up here with those men, trying to drag me back, I didn't want revenge. I just wanted him gone. I wanted to live my life without him in it. And has that worked?" "Mostly," she smiled slightly, "though I won't pretend it didn't feel good, watching Marshall Weaver run him off." Rowan laughed, the sound surprising them both. "Fair enough. There's a difference between wanting revenge and enjoying justice." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the storm paint the world white. Somewhere in the distance, a tree branch cracked under the weight of accumulated snow, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, testing the walls Rowan had built, finding no weakness. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "These last weeks, teaching you, having someone to talk to, feeling useful again, it's reminded me who I used to be, who I still could be. You are useful. You're a doctor, Rowan. That doesn't change just because some people chose to believe lies." "No, but it changed how I saw myself. And getting that back," he broke off, shaking his head. "I owe you more than you know. You saved my life. I think that makes us even. I gave you shelter and medical care. You gave me purpose again. That's not even close to even." Before Lydia could respond, something slammed against the cabin door. Not a knock, but an impact, heavy and desperate. They both jumped, Rowan reaching instinctively for the rifle that was always close at hand. "Help!" The voice was male, young, terrified. "Please, someone help us!" Rowan had the door open in seconds. A man stumbled in, barely out of his teens, covered in snow and wild-eyed with panic. Behind him, visible through the swirling white, another figure slumped in the snow. "My friend, the ice broke. He fell in the creek." The words tumbled out incoherently. "He's not breathing right. He won't wake up. Please." Rowan was already moving, grabbing blankets and his medical kit. Lydia, stoke the fire as hot as it'll go. Get the bed ready. He plunged out into the storm, and she watched through the window as he hauled the unconscious man up, carrying him like he weighed nothing despite the snow and ice making every step treacherous. The patient was blue-lipped and shaking violently, his breathing shallow and rapid. Water dripped from his clothes, freezing almost immediately in the cabin's warmth. Hypothermia, Rowan said, already stripping away the wet garments with practiced efficiency. Advanced stage. Lydia, I need you to help me warm him slowly, too fast and we could stop his heart. She worked alongside him, following instructions without hesitation. They wrapped the man in blankets warmed by the fire, placed heated stones wrapped in cloth at his major arteries, forced warm liquid between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. The young man who'd brought him paced frantically, explaining through chattering teeth how they'd been trying to cross the creek, how the ice had looked solid, how his friend had gone through before he could stop him. Is he going to die? The question came out small, terrified. Not if I can help it. Rowan had his fingers on the patient's wrist, counting pulse, his expression intensely focused. But the next few hours are critical. Lydia, his core temperature is still too low. We need more warmth. She understood immediately what he wasn't saying. Body heat was the most efficient warming method, but it required close contact, skin to skin. I'll do it. Rowan's eyes met hers, a question in them. She nodded firmly, and he helped her position herself beside the patient under the blankets, her body heat radiating into his cold skin. It was deeply uncomfortable, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with desire, but she forced herself to stay still, to breathe slowly, to will warmth into him. Rowan monitored them both constantly, adjusting blankets, replacing cooling stones with hot ones, administering small amounts of warm broth when the patient could manage it. Hours passed. The storm outside intensified, but inside the cabin they fought their own battle against death. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, color began returning to the patient's face. His breathing deepened, steadied. His violent shivering decreased to occasional tremors. And finally, as dawn was breaking somewhere beyond the storm clouds, his eyes opened. Where? His voice was a croak. You're safe. Lydia carefully extricated herself from the blankets, muscles screaming from holding still for so long. You fell through ice. Your friend brought you here. The young man rushed to the bedside, tears streaming down his face. James, thank God. I was so scared. I'm okay. James tried to sit up, fell back weakly. I think. You will be. Rowan handed Lydia a cup of broth, then prepared another for James. But you're staying put for at least a day. Moving too soon after severe hypothermia can cause complications. We can stay? The friend looked shocked. But everyone says, they say you're a monster who eats travelers? Rowan's tone was dry. Yes, I've heard the stories. They're remarkably persistent despite having no basis in fact. We didn't know where else to go. The storm came up so fast, and after James fell in, the young man's voice broke. You saved his life. Miss Hale saved his life. I just provided the medical knowledge. Rowan gestured to Lydia, who was wrapping herself in a dry blanket, trying to stop her own shivering. She's the one who spent 4 hours keeping him warm while I monitored his vitals. Both young men looked at her with something like awe, and Lydia felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. I just did what needed doing, she said quietly. That's more than most would do for a stranger. James reached out a weak hand toward her. Thank you. She took his hand, squeezed gently. You're welcome. Now drink your broth before it gets cold. The storm trapped them all in the cabin for 2 more days. It should have been cramped and awkward, but instead it felt almost like family, Rowan teaching the young men basic first aid while Lydia cooked, everyone sharing stories and laughter, the fear of those first desperate hours transforming into something warmer. The young men were trappers, partners working a line in the high country, and they repaid Rowan's care with promises to spread word that the doctor on Blackwood Mountain was someone to seek out, not avoid. We'll tell everyone, James promised as they prepared to leave, the storm finally broken. Tell them you saved my life. Tell them the stories are lies. Tell them there's a real doctor up here who doesn't turn people away. Just tell them the truth, Rowan said. That's all I ask. After they left, the cabin felt strangely empty, despite being occupied by only 2 people instead of 4. Lydia caught herself listening for voices that weren't there, looking for faces that had moved on. "You miss them," Rowan observed, watching her stare at the door. "Is that strange? I barely knew them." "Not strange at all. You're not built for solitude the way I thought I was." He moved to his medical table, began restocking supplies they'd used. "You're built for people, for helping, for connection. That's a gift." It didn't feel like a gift at the crossroads. It felt like a weakness everyone exploited. Because they were small people who made themselves big by making you small. He measured herbs with careful precision. But with decent people, people worth knowing, that capacity for connection is powerful. I watched you with James and his friend. You made them feel safe, made this strange situation bearable. That's a skill as valuable as any medicine I know. His words settled into her chest, warm and affirming. For so long she'd believed the crossroads version of herself, the one who was too much, too loud, too present, too hungry for connection. But maybe that had been the lie. Maybe caring deeply wasn't a flaw, but a feature. And the problem had been the people who'd punished her for it. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of visitors. Word spread through the mountain communities exactly as James had promised. There was a doctor on Blackwood Mountain, a real one, and he didn't charge money they didn't have or judge them for their rough ways. Rowan treated them all with the same careful attention, and Lydia assisted in an increasingly official capacity, her skills growing with each patient. She learned to recognize infection by smell and appearance, to mix poultices and tinctures from Rowan's careful instructions, to calm frightened patients with gentle words while Rowan worked. He taught her anatomy using the medical texts and his own body as reference, explaining how bones connected, where major blood vessels ran, what each organ did. She absorbed it all hungrily, staying up late by lamplight to study, asking questions until Rowan's voice grew hoarse from answering. "You could be a real nurse," he told her one evening, watching her successfully stitch a trapper's lacerated palm while he supervised. "With proper training, certification, you have the aptitude for it." "Where would I get proper training? The nearest nursing school is probably back east somewhere." "Maybe. Or maybe we create our own training here. I teach you everything I know, you practice on actual patients, and in a few years you're as competent as any nurse from a fancy school." The idea took root in her imagination. Being a nurse, a real medical professional, someone whose skills mattered. Not just the fat cook people tolerated, but someone essential, someone who made a difference. But peace, Lydia was learning, was always temporary. It was a Tuesday when Gerald Cutler returned, and this time he'd brought lawyers. Lydia was hanging laundry on the line Rowan had strung between 2 pines when she heard horses. 3 of them, moving slowly, carrying men in suits that looked absurd against the mountain backdrop. Cutler rode at the center, his expression smug and self-satisfied in a way that made her stomach clench. "Rowan!" she called toward the cabin, keeping her voice level despite the fear crawling up her spine. He emerged immediately, took in the scene, and his expression hardened. "Stay behind me, behind." The riders halted at the clearing's edge. The man in the center, older, with silver spectacles and an air of authority, dismounted carefully and approached with a leather portfolio under his arm. "Dr. Rowan Blackwood? That's me. My name is Edmund Price. I'm an attorney representing Mr. Gerald Cutler in the matter of restitution owed by Miss Lydia Hale for damages incurred during her employment at the Crossroads Inn." He spoke with the careful enunciation of someone who lived by words. "I have here a legal writ demanding payment in the sum of $150, or failing that, a return to employment until such debt is satisfied." Rowan didn't move. "Miss Hale owes nothing. She was beaten and abandoned. Any debt was voided by that treatment." "That's not how the law sees it." Price withdrew papers from his portfolio, holding them up like a shield. "According to territorial statute, employment contracts can only be voided through mutual agreement or legal dissolution. Mr. Cutler did not agree to void the contract, and no legal dissolution was filed. Therefore, Miss Hale remains bound by her employment agreement." "She was beaten with an iron poker." Rowan's voice was deadly quiet. "Are you telling me the law says that's acceptable?" "I'm telling you the law says employment contracts are binding." Price's expression was professionally neutral. "If you wish to dispute the debt, you may file a countersuit. But until such time as a judge rules otherwise, Miss Hale is legally obligated to either pay or return to work. Like hell she is. Rowan stepped forward, and Price stepped back. She's not going anywhere with you. Then you're harboring someone who's violated a legal contract. Cutler spoke for the first time, his voice dripping with false concern. That makes you criminally liable, Doctor. Could be prosecuted for it. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. The trap she'd known was coming. Cutler hadn't given up. He'd just changed tactics. Instead of force, he'd weaponized the law itself. How much? She heard herself ask. How much does he claim I owe? Lydia, no, Rowan started. How much? She pushed past him, facing Price directly. For the dress, the disruption, all of it. What's the total? Price consulted his papers. $150, plus interest accruing at 5% per month from the date of the initial incident. A fortune. More money than she'd see in 5 years of work, probably more. The number was designed to be impossible, to ensure she'd never pay it off, to trap her in perpetual servitude. I don't have that kind of money. She forced herself to meet Cutler's eyes. You know I don't. That's the whole point, isn't it? Make the debt so high I can never escape it. The debt is what it is. But Cutler's smile confirmed her accusation. You can come back to work, or the doctor here can pay it for you. Either way, it gets settled. I'll pay it. Rowan's words fell like stones. Everyone turned to stare at him. Price's eyebrows rose. Cutler's smile widened, and Lydia felt something crack in her chest. Rowan, you can't. I can, and I will. He looked at Price. I'll need time to gather the funds. A week, maybe 2. That's acceptable, provided Miss Hale remains in your custody and doesn't flee. Price made a note in his papers. Consider her on surety pending payment. She's not in my custody. She's a free woman making her own choices. Then she's free to return with Mr. Cutler today. Price's tone suggested this wasn't up for debate. The law is quite clear on this point. Fine. Rowan's jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. She's in my custody. Happy? Delighted. Cutler was practically glowing. We'll return in 2 weeks for payment. And doctor, if you don't have it, or if she runs, I'll see you both prosecuted to the full extent of the law. They left, Cutler shooting triumphant looks over his shoulder. Price simply looked bored, like this was just another case, just another day of using legal language to trap desperate people. When they were gone, Lydia turned on Rowan. You can't pay that. You don't have that kind of money. I have some savings, medical equipment I could sell. Your equipment? Rowan, you need that to practice. I need you to be safe more than I need a few surgical instruments. He moved toward the cabin, his shoulders rigid with suppressed anger. This isn't up for discussion. The hell it isn't? She followed him inside. You're going to bankrupt yourself to pay a debt that shouldn't exist? That's insane. What's insane is letting them take you back. He whirled to face her, and the raw emotion in his eyes stopped her words. Do you have any idea what they'll do to you? Cutler will work you to death just to prove he can. You'll never be free, Lydia. Never. Unless I pay this debt and end it. So instead I'll owe you? Be obligated to you for the rest of my life? You don't owe me anything, his voice cracked. This isn't about debt or obligation or payment. This is about... He broke off, ran his hands through his hair. This is about not letting them destroy you. About standing between you and the people who see you as property instead of a person. By becoming my owner instead? The words were cruel, deliberately so, and she watched them hit him like physical blows. Is that what you think? That I want to own you? I don't know what to think. Tears were burning in her eyes now, hot and furious. For weeks I felt safe here, felt like maybe I was building something that mattered, and now Cutler shows up with lawyers and suddenly I'm property again, just changing hands from one man to another. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, I'm still trapped, still defined by debts I didn't agree to and contracts I never signed, still powerless. Rowan sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. I can't fix this by paying your debt. That just transfers the power from Cutler to me, and that's not freedom. So what do we do? We fight it, legally. He looked up at her, and determination was hardening his features. Price said you could file a countersuit. So that's what we'll do. Sue Cutler for assault, for wrongful termination, for abandonment. Make him defend his actions in court instead of hiding behind a fraudulent contract. With what money? Lawyers cost more than I owe. Then we find one who'll work for trade or on contingency. Rowan stood, pacing now, his mind clearly racing. Marshal Weaver seemed sympathetic. He might know someone, or at least point us in the right direction. And if we can't find anyone? Then I represent you myself. I'm educated, I can read legal texts, and I'm extremely motivated. A bitter smile touched his mouth. They want to play legal games? Fine. I survived being accused of murder. I can handle a contract dispute. Hope flickered in Lydia's chest, fragile but real. You'd do that? Risk going to town, facing people again, just to fight this? I'd do that and more. He crossed to her, took her hands in his, an unprecedented gesture that made her breath catch. You're not alone in this, Lydia. Not anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what partnership means. Partnership. Not ownership, not obligation, but partnership. The words settled into her bones like warmth after cold, like the first breath after drowning. Okay, she said. Then we fight. They rode down the mountain 2 days later, Lydia on one of Rowan's horses, Rowan on the other, both of them dressed as well as mountain living allowed. The town, when it came into view, looked simultaneously familiar and foreign. The same buildings, the same muddy streets, but now she saw it through different eyes. Not as someone trapped and desperate, but as someone with allies, with purpose, with the right to defend herself. Marshal Weaver met them at his office, listened to their story without interruption, then leaned back in his chair and whistled low. That's a hell of a situation. Cutler's always been a bastard, but using the courts to trap you, that's a new low, even for him. Can we fight it? Rowan leaned forward. Is there legal precedent for voiding a contract when one party has been assaulted? Probably, but I'm not a lawyer. What you need is Simon Foster. He's the territorial judge, rides the circuit. He'll be in town next week for regular sessions. Weaver pulled out a calendar, consulted it. You could petition to have your case heard then. Will he listen? To me, I mean? Lydia forced herself to ask. Or will he see a fat woman with no prospects and decide Cutler's version sounds more believable? Weaver looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Judge Foster's daughter was in an arranged marriage once. Her husband beat her, and when she tried to leave, he used the law to force her back. Foster watched her suffer for 2 years before the man finally died and freed her. His eyes were sad. He doesn't have patience for men who hide behind contracts to abuse women. He'll listen. And if he doesn't rule in our favor, then I'll testify about your injuries when I found you, and I'll make sure everyone knows what Cutler did. Weaver stood, extending his hand to Rowan. You've got my support, Doctor, both of you. It's past time someone stood up to Gerald Cutler. They left the marshal's office with something resembling hope. The town was busier than Lydia remembered. People moving through streets made muddy by melting snow. Some stared at them. The monster and his captive, she imagined them thinking. But others nodded greetings, and a few even smiled. Word spread, Rowan murmured, about the patients I've been treating. Is that good or bad? Depends on whether they believe the old stories or the new ones. They had their answer when they reached the general store for supplies, and the owner, a woman Lydia had never met, greeted them warmly and refused payment for the medical supplies Rowan ordered. My nephew was the boy who fell through the ice, she explained. James told me what you did, how you saved his life. This is the least I can do. I can't accept. You can and you will. She pressed the package into his hands firmly. You're a good man, Dr. Blackwood. Don't let anyone tell you different. Similar scenes played out at the feed store, the blacksmith, even the small cafe where they stopped for coffee. People who'd heard the stories, the true ones, not the invented ones, expressed gratitude, offered help, treated them with respect. But not everyone was convinced. They were leaving the cafe when a woman's voice cut through the afternoon air, sharp with disgust. Well, well, the whore and her keeper. Lydia turned to find Mrs. Crawford standing in the street, flanked by 2 other well-dressed women who looked at Lydia like she was something scraped off a boot. Mrs. Crawford. Lydia kept her voice level. Good afternoon. Is it? I wouldn't know, having my day ruined by the sight of indecency parading through town. Mrs. Crawford's eyes raked over Lydia with contempt. Living in sin with a man on a mountain pretending to be some kind of nurse. Have you no shame? I have plenty of shame, Mrs. Crawford, but none of it is for choosing dignity over abuse. Lydia stepped forward, and she had the satisfaction of seeing the woman's eyes widen slightly. You helped put me on that mountain. You wanted me punished for ruining your dress. Well, you got your wish. I was beaten, bound, and left to die. Is that enough punishment for you, or should I have frozen to death to really satisfy your sense of justice? How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Speak to you as an equal instead of groveling? Lydia felt years of suppressed anger rising, hot and clean. You treated me like I was worthless because I'm fat, because I was poor, because I had no power to defend myself. But I'm not that person anymore. I have worth, I have skills, and I have someone who values me for what I can do, not what I look like. That's more than you have, with all your expensive dresses and your cruel tongue. Mrs. Crawford's face went through several shades of red. You insolent! That's enough. Rowan's hand settled on Lydia's shoulder, not restraining but supporting. Mrs. Crawford, I suggest you continue about your business. We've said all that needs saying. They walked away, leaving the woman sputtering in the street. Lydia's hands were shaking, adrenaline making her dizzy, but she felt lighter than she had in years. That was bold, Rowan said when they were out of earshot. That was necessary. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I spent 2 years letting people like her make me feel small. I'm done with that. Good. He smiled, and it was full of pride. You're magnificent when you're angry. They returned to the mountain as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. The cabin looked small against the vast wilderness, but it also looked like home, warm light glowing in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney, a place they'd built together from exile and necessity. Inside, they prepared supper in comfortable silence, each moving around the other with the ease of long practice. But something had shifted between them during the day in town, something neither was quite ready to name. Thank you, Lydia said finally, as they sat down to eat. For today. For fighting for me. You fought for yourself. Rowan passed her the bread. I just stood beside you. That's more than anyone else has ever done. They ate, and the silence wrapped around them like the mountain wrapped around the cabin, protective, sustaining, complete. Outside, the first stars were appearing in a sky so clear it looked close enough to touch. And inside, two people who'd been broken by the world began the slow, careful process of becoming whole again. Together. The week before the trial, Rowan transformed the cabin into a makeshift law office. Medical texts were temporarily shelved in favor of territorial statutes and legal precedents borrowed from Marshall Weaver. He spent hours reading by lamplight, taking notes in his precise hand, building their case line by methodical line. Lydia watched him work with a mixture of gratitude and fear. He was risking so much for her, his privacy, his hard-won peace, his carefully constructed exile. If they lost, Cutler would not only reclaim her, but would likely make Rowan's life impossible out of sheer vindictiveness. Stop worrying, Rowan said without looking up from his reading. I can hear you thinking from here. How do you know I'm worrying? Because you've stirred that pot 17 times in the last 5 minutes, and whatever's in it doesn't need that much attention. He set down his pen, rubbed his eyes. Talk to me. What's going through your head? What if we lose? The fear she'd been holding back spilled out. What if Judge Foster doesn't believe me, or decides the contract is valid regardless of what Cutler did, or then we appeal? And if that fails, we find another way. He stood, crossed to where she was standing at the stove. Lydia, look at me. She did, and the certainty in his eyes steadied her. I will not let them take you back. I don't care what the law says, what judges rule, what contracts claim. You are not property. You're not going back to that place. Do you understand? That sounds like you're planning to break the law. If necessary, yes. He said it calmly, as if discussing the weather. I'll take you to Montana or Colorado or all the way to California if that's what it takes. I have some money saved, and I can practice medicine anywhere. We'll start over. You'd give up everything? This cabin, this mountain, the life you've built? I gave up everything once before. I can do it again. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheek with unexpected tenderness. But I don't think it'll come to that. We have truth on our side. That has to count for something. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that truth mattered more than power, that justice would prevail over corruption. But she'd seen too much of the world's casual cruelty to fully embrace that faith. Still, when trial day arrived, she dressed in the simple wool dress they'd made together and rode down the mountain with her head high. If this was a fight, she'd meet it standing. The territorial courthouse was packed. Word had spread through the mountain communities, the beast of Blackwood Mountain was coming to town, and the woman he'd supposedly kidnapped was suing her former employer. People crowded the benches, lined the walls, pressed against the windows from outside. Some faces were curious, some hostile, but many were familiar. The young hunter whose brother Rowan had saved, the woman whose daughter had recovered from fever, the trappers who'd brought their injuries to the mountain and found healing instead of horror. They'd come to bear witness. Gerald Cutler sat at the plaintiff's table with Edmund Price, looking smug and confident. He'd dressed well for the occasion, his suit pressed and new, his hair pomaded into submission. Next to him, Mrs. Crawford occupied a seat of honor, her presence a silent statement about the quality of people supporting his case. Rowan and Lydia took their seats at the defendant's table. Rowan had refused to hire a lawyer, insisting he could represent her himself. Now, seeing Price's professional preparation, Lydia felt a flutter of doubt. All rise for the Honorable Judge Simon Foster. The courtroom stood as one. Judge Foster entered, a man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He took his seat, surveyed the packed room, and his expression suggested he knew exactly what kind of circus this would become. We're here for the matter of Cutler versus Hale, a contract dispute with allegations of assault and wrongful termination. Mr. Price, you're representing the plaintiff? I am, Your Honor. Price stood, smooth and polished. We'll prove that Miss Hale violated a legally binding employment contract and owes Mr. Cutler substantial damages for property destruction and breach of agreement. And you, Dr. Blackwood, are representing yourself and Miss Hale. I am, Your Honor. Rowan's voice was steady. We'll prove that any contract was voided when Mr. Cutler assaulted Miss Hale and abandoned her on a mountain trail with the intent that she should die. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Foster banged his gavel once, silence falling immediately. Those are serious allegations. Mr. Price, present your case. Price was good, Lydia had to admit. He painted a picture of her as a careless employee who'd destroyed valuable property, refused to make restitution, and fled her legal obligations. He presented the ruined dress, somehow preserved, as evidence. He called witnesses who testified to her clumsiness, her frequent mistakes, her general incompetence. And when Mr. Cutler quite reasonably asked her to work off the debt, Price concluded, she instead ran away to the mountain, where she's been living in sin with Dr. Blackwood, hiding from her legal responsibilities. Living in sin? Foster's eyebrows rose. That's a moral judgment, counselor, not a legal argument. It speaks to her character, Your Honor. A woman who would abandon her obligations and shack up with a man unmarried. Careful, Mr. Price. Foster's voice was cold. I won't have moral grandstanding in my courtroom. Stick to the facts of the contract dispute. Price sat down, looking only slightly chastened. Cutler was smiling, confident the case was won. Foster turned to Rowan. Dr. Blackwood, your response? Rowan stood, and Lydia saw something in his bearing shift. The uncertain exile becoming the confident physician, the man who'd once commanded operating rooms and inspired trust in desperate patients. Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness, Miss Lydia Hale. Lydia stood on shaking legs and made her way to the witness stand. The room felt too hot, too crowded, too full of eyes judging her every move. But when she looked at Rowan, his expression was encouraging, supportive. Miss Hale, please tell the court what happened the night of the incident with Mrs. Crawford's dress. She did, her voice growing stronger as she went. She described the crowded dining room, the unexpected movement, the accident that sent water cascading over expensive fabric. Then she described what came after, Cutler's rage, the iron poker, the beating that cracked her ribs and split her lip. He said I was worthless, she told the court, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. He said I wasn't worth the scraps he fed me. And then he said he knew someone who would take me, the beast on Blackwood Mountain. He said maybe Dr. Blackwood would keep me, maybe he'd kill me, but either way I wouldn't be his problem anymore. And then what happened? He had me locked in the root cellar overnight. The next morning, he tied my wrists, loaded me in a wagon, and drove me up the mountain. When we reached the end of the road, he threw me out and told me Dr. Blackwood's cabin was 3 miles north. Then he left me there and drove away. With injuries from the beating? Yes. I could barely walk. I thought I was going to die on that trail. She looked directly at Cutler, saw his smirk falter. I think that's what he wanted, for me to die so the problem would disappear. Price objected strenuously, claiming she was making unfounded accusations. Foster allowed the objection but told the jury to note her testimony. Miss Hale, Rowan continued, did you at any time agree to go to the mountain? Did you consent to this arrangement? No, I begged him not to do it. I said I'd work harder. I'd find a way to pay for the dress. He didn't care. And when you reached Dr. Blackwood's cabin, what happened? He saved my life. She looked at Rowan, and something in her chest tightened. He treated my injuries, gave me shelter, asked nothing in return except that I heal. And when I was strong enough to leave, he gave me a choice. Stay or go. No judgment either way. I chose to stay. Why? Because for the first time in 2 years, someone treated me like I mattered, like I was worth saving. The tears came now, but she didn't try to hide them. At the crossroads, I was nothing, furniture to be used and discarded. On the mountain, I was a person. I had worth. I had purpose. Dr. Blackwood taught me medicine, let me assist with patients, showed me I could be more than what the world told me I was. Thank you, Miss Hale. Your Honor, I'd like to present physical evidence. Rowan produced the ropes Cutler had used, the blood on them still visible after weeks. He presented drawings he'd made of her injuries, precise medical illustrations showing the locations and severity of each bruise, each cut. And finally, he called Marshal Weaver to testify about her condition when the marshal had first seen her. She looked like she'd been beaten within an inch of her life, Weaver said bluntly. Bruises everywhere, ribs clearly damaged, rope burns on her wrists. I've seen bar fights that did less damage. And in your professional opinion, Marshal, were these injuries consistent with Miss Hale's account? Absolutely, no question. Price cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest Lydia had gotten the injuries some other way, that she was lying to avoid her obligations. But Weaver held firm, and his testimony carried weight. Then Rowan called his unexpected witness, Samuel Garrett. The man looked deeply uncomfortable as he took the stand, avoiding Cutler's furious glare. But when Rowan asked him what he'd seen that night at the crossroads, he told the truth. Gerald beat her bad. Worse than I've ever seen him beat anyone, and I've seen him get rough before. He was in a rage, kept hitting her even after she was on the ground. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Garrett's voice was quiet with shame. Then he said he was giving her to the mountain man, and I didn't object. I should have, but I didn't. I just helped lock her up and stayed silent. Why are you testifying now? Rowan asked. Because it's been eating at me. What we did to her, what I let happen, it was wrong. And when I saw her on that mountain, saw how Dr. Blackwood was protecting her, treating her with respect, he shook his head. Made me realize we're the monsters in this story, not him. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Foster banged his gavel, restoring order, but the damage was done. Cutler's own employee had turned against him. Price tried to salvage the situation during his cross-examination, but Garrett wouldn't be shaken. Yes, Lydia had been clumsy. Yes, the dress was expensive. But no, that didn't justify beating her and leaving her to die. Finally, Rowan called his last witness, himself. Dr. Blackwood, Foster said, you understand you're under oath? I do, Your Honor. Then tell me, and be honest, what was your relationship with Miss Hale when she arrived at your cabin? I'd never met her before. I didn't know she was coming. I found her collapsed on my trail, badly injured, barely conscious. I treated her injuries as I would any patient. And when she recovered, I offered her a choice. She could leave, try to make her way in the world alone, or she could stay and help me in exchange for shelter and safety. She chose to stay. Are you romantically involved with Miss Hale? The courtroom held its breath. Lydia felt her face flush hot. No, Your Honor. Rowan's voice was absolutely steady. Miss Hale is my colleague, my assistant, my friend. I value her greatly, but our relationship is not romantic in nature. It was true, and yet somehow it hurt to hear said so plainly. Lydia pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't the time for examining her own confused emotions. Do you love her? Price objected, but Foster waved him off. I'm trying to determine if there's any truth to the living in sin allegations. Answer the question, Doctor. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear. I respect her. I admire her strength, her intelligence, her capacity for compassion despite everything she's endured. If that's love, then yes, I suppose I do. But I have never and would never take advantage of her vulnerable position. She is free to leave any time she chooses. She stays because she wants to, not because I've trapped her. Foster nodded slowly. Thank you, Dr. Blackwood. You may step down. He looked at both tables. Closing arguments? Price went first, reiterating the contract's validity, arguing that whatever happened to Lydia after the incident didn't void her obligations. It was polished, professional, and entirely heartless. Then Rowan stood for his closing. Your Honor, this case isn't really about a contract or a ruined dress. It's about power and how it's abused. Gerald Cutler had power over Lydia Hale, economic power, social power, physical power. And when she made a mistake, he used that power not to seek fair restitution, but to destroy her. He moved to stand beside Lydia's chair, his hand resting on the back of it. He beat her for an accident. He tied her up like an animal. He drove her into the wilderness and abandoned her, hoping nature would do what he didn't have the courage to do himself, end her life and erase the problem. And now he has the audacity to come into this court and claim she owes him money? That she violated a contract? Rowan's voice rose, filling the courtroom with barely controlled anger. The only contract that was violated was the social contract that says we don't treat human beings like disposable property. The only debt owed here is the debt Mr. Cutler owes to Miss Hale for the damage he did to her body, her spirit, her sense of safety in the world. And the only justice this court can provide is to tell Gerald Cutler that the law doesn't protect men who hide their cruelty behind paperwork and legal language. He returned to his seat, and the courtroom was absolutely silent. Foster sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. I've heard enough. I'm ready to rule. It was faster than Lydia had expected. Shouldn't there be deliberation, discussion, more time? But Foster's expression was decided, his mind clearly made up. In the matter of Cutler versus Hale, I find for the defendant. Relief crashed through Lydia so hard she nearly collapsed. Beside her, Rowan's hand found hers under the table, squeezed tight. Furthermore, Foster continued, his voice hard, I find that any employment contract between Mr. Cutler and Miss Hale was void the moment he assaulted her. No contract survives violence. No agreement remains valid when one party attempts to murder the other. Your Honor, that's an extreme characterization, Price tried to object. Is it? He beat her, bound her, and left her on a mountain trail with instructions to walk 3 miles in her condition. What would you call that, counselor? Foster's glare could have melted steel. I call it attempted murder, and I'm seriously considering referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal charges. Cutler's face went white. Mrs. Crawford stood abruptly and left the courtroom, her expensive skirts rustling indignantly. Mr. Cutler, Foster said, you are fortunate that Miss Hale seems to want closure more than revenge, or you'd be facing far worse than a dismissed lawsuit. As it stands, you are to have no further contact with her. You are not to approach her, speak to her, or send representatives to harass her. If I hear that you violated this order, I will have you arrested. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Cutler's voice was barely audible. Good. And one more thing. I'm awarding Miss Hale damages in the sum of $200 for pain, suffering, and lost wages. You have 30 days to pay. The courtroom exploded in noise, some cheering, some gasping, everyone talking at once. Foster banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. Furthermore, he said, looking directly at Rowan, Dr. Blackwood, I've heard testimony about the medical work you've been doing on the mountain. The territory has need of skilled physicians willing to serve remote communities. I'm officially recognizing your practice and authorizing you to treat patients under territorial medical regulations. Welcome back to medicine, Doctor. Rowan stood slowly, and Lydia saw his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me. Thank the people who came here today to testify on your behalf. They're the ones who convinced me the stories about you were lies. Foster banged his gavel one final time. Court is adjourned. The crowd surged forward, trappers shaking Rowan's hand, mothers thanking Lydia for her kindness, even Marshal Weaver offering his congratulations. It was overwhelming, joyful, the kind of vindication Lydia had never imagined possible. Through it all, Cutler sat at his table, diminished and defeated. When he finally stood to leave, no one moved aside for him. He had to push through the crowd that had once feared him, and Lydia watched him go with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. He'd destroyed himself with his own cruelty. That was justice enough. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was brilliant against fresh snow. Rowan and Lydia stood on the steps, watching the town move around them with new eyes. $200, Lydia said, still processing. That's more money than I've ever had. It's less than you deserve, but it's a start. Rowan looked down at her, and his expression was soft. What will you do with it? I don't know. Save some, maybe use some to buy medical supplies for the practice. She smiled. We'll need more equipment if you're going to be official. We? You don't think I'm leaving now, do you? Not when I'm finally learning something useful. She bumped his shoulder with hers. Besides, someone has to keep you from becoming a hermit again. I suppose I could use an assistant. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes, especially one who's not afraid to tell me when I'm being stubborn. They started toward the horses, but a voice stopped them. Miss Hale? Dr. Blackwood? They turned to find a young woman standing nervously at the courthouse steps. She was thin, poorly dressed, with a black eye that looked recent. I heard what happened in there, she said quietly, about how you helped Miss Hale when she had nowhere to go. I was wondering... She hesitated. I was wondering if maybe you'd have room for one more. On the mountain, I mean. I can work, I'm strong. I need somewhere safe. Lydia looked at Rowan, saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They had a cabin, a practice, a life they'd built from nothing, and they had room, not just physical space, but space in their lives for someone who needed help. What's your name? Lydia asked gently. Sarah Mills. Well, Sarah, let's talk about what you need and what we can offer, but I think we can probably work something out. The girl's face transformed with hope, and Lydia remembered what that felt like. That first moment of believing things might actually get better. They spent another hour in town, gathering supplies, accepting congratulations, making plans. By the time they started back up the mountain, the sun was setting and Sarah was riding behind Lydia, her few possessions in a small bundle. Is it really safe up there? Sarah asked as they climbed into the high country. People say a lot of things. Lydia looked back at her with understanding. Most of them are lies. You'll see for yourself. The cabin appeared as darkness fell, warm light glowing in the windows like a beacon. Rowan had left a lamp burning before they departed that morning, and now it welcomed them home. Home. The word had new meaning now, not just a building, but a feeling, a sense of belonging she'd never thought to have again. Inside, they settled Sarah in the small room Rowan had been using, giving her privacy and space to heal. Lydia prepared supper while Rowan examined the girl's injuries. Nothing serious, but evidence of the hard life she'd been living. She'll be okay, he said later, after Sarah had fallen asleep. Malnourished, exhausted, but nothing time and care won't fix. Like me, Lydia said. Like you. He poured them both tea, settled into his familiar chair by the fire. Seems like the cabin's becoming a refuge whether we planned it or not. Is that a bad thing? No, I think it might be exactly what this place was meant to be. He sipped his tea, watching the flames. A place where people who've been broken can come to heal, where the world's cast-offs can find value again. That's beautiful. It's also practical. Winter's coming on hard and there's more work than two people can handle. If Sarah's willing to help, we can expand, take in more patients, maybe even build an addition for recovery rooms. Lydia could see it, the cabin growing, becoming not just a home, but a sanctuary. A place where the mountain's reputation for horror transformed into a reputation for healing. We'd need more supplies, more training for both Sarah and me. We have time, and we have $200 to start with, he smiled, plus whatever I can earn from treating patients. It won't be rich living, but it'll be enough. It'll be more than enough. Lydia set down her tea, moved to stand at the window. Outside, stars were emerging in the clear mountain sky, brilliant against the darkness. Do you ever regret it? Leaving Denver, building this life out here? I used to. For the first year, I regretted it every day. He joined her at the window, their reflections ghostly in the glass. But now? No. This life, what we're building here, it's more honest than anything I had before. No politics, no backstabbing, no lies. Just work that matters and people who need help. And me? She asked it quietly, afraid of the answer. Especially you. He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. Lydia, I meant what I said in court. I respect you, I admire you, but I didn't tell the whole truth. What do you mean? I do love you, not as a colleague or a friend, though you're both those things. I love you as, he struggled for words, as the person who brought light back into my life, who reminded me that exile doesn't have to mean loneliness, who's strong enough to walk 3 miles on broken ribs and brave enough to stand up to her abusers in a courtroom. Lydia's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Rowan, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know the power dynamic is complicated, that you're still healing, that maybe you'll never see me as anything but the man who gave you shelter. But I needed you to know. You deserve to know. She reached up, cupped his face in her hands the way he'd done for her so many weeks ago. His beard was soft under her palms, his skin warm despite the cold seeping through the window. You beautiful fool, she whispered. Don't you know I've loved you since the day you stood between me and Cutler's men? Since you taught me I was worth protecting. Lydia. She kissed him, and it was nothing like she'd imagined kisses should be. It was awkward and unpracticed. Two people who'd forgotten how to be soft learning tenderness together. But it was also perfect, warm and real, and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to rush you. We can take this slow, figure out what it means. It means we're partners in every way now. She smiled against his lips. In work, in life, in whatever comes next. That's what it means. I can live with that. They stood together at the window, watching the stars and holding each other close. Outside, the mountain was settling in for winter, the world contracting to just this space, these people, this fragile, beautiful life they were building. The weeks that followed were full of work and wonder. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, eager to help with both household tasks and medical care. She had a gentle way with patients that reminded Lydia of the best nurses she'd read about in Rowan's texts. More people came as word spread. The doctor on Blackwood Mountain had been vindicated, was practicing legally, was someone to trust. Some came for treatment, others came seeking refuge. A widow fleeing an abusive son-in-law. A veteran with wounds that wouldn't heal, physical and otherwise. A young couple expecting their first child and terrified of the birth. The cabin expanded. Rowan and Lydia, with help from grateful patients and their families, built an addition that could house recovering patients. They established a small herb garden in a sheltered corner, planting medicinal plants that would survive the harsh winters. They created a proper examining room, separate from the living space. And through it all, Lydia and Rowan grew together, learning each other's rhythms, building a relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. There was romance, yes, but it was the kind forged in work and partnership, in standing together against challenges, in the daily choice to build something meaningful. Spring came eventually, as it always does. Snow melted, revealing the mountain's bones, and with the thaw came more visitors. Some sought medical care. Others came simply to see the place where the monster had been revealed as a healer. On a warm April afternoon, Lydia was hanging laundry when she saw riders approaching. For a moment, old fear spiked. Had Cutler returned? But as they drew closer, she recognized Marshal Weaver, and beside him rode Judge Foster. "Company!" she called toward the cabin, and Rowan emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Marshal, Your Honor," he greeted them warmly. "What brings you up the mountain?" "Official business," Foster said, dismounting with a grimace that spoke of saddle-sore bones. "I'm making rounds through the territory, checking on medical practices. Thought I'd see how yours was coming along." "And unofficially?" Rowan asked with a slight smile. "Unofficially, I wanted to see the miracle for myself. The beast of Blackwood Mountain, reformed and respectable." Foster's eyes twinkled. "Though I suspect you were never the beast they claimed." They gave the judge a tour: the expanded cabin, the examining room, the patient recovery area where 2 people were currently resting. Foster asked detailed questions about procedures, treatments, outcomes. His expression grew increasingly impressed. "You've built something remarkable here," he said finally. "A full medical practice in the middle of nowhere, serving people who'd otherwise have no access to care. The territory needs more of this." "We do what we can," Rowan said modestly. "It's more than that." Foster pulled out a document from his coat. "I've been authorized by the Territorial Medical Board to offer you something. A formal appointment as the territorial physician for the High Country region. It comes with a small stipend, supplies, and official recognition. You'd be expected to provide care to anyone who needs it, regardless of ability to pay." Rowan took the document, read it carefully. Lydia watched his expression shift from surprise to something that might have been joy. "I accept," he said quietly, "with gratitude." "Excellent." Foster shook his hand firmly. "And Miss Hale, I understand you've been training as a medical assistant?" "I have, Your Honor. The territory is starting a program to certify nurses and medical assistants. I'd like to recommend you for it. Training would be mostly what you're already doing, with some additional coursework and examination. Interested?" Lydia looked at Rowan, who was nodding encouragement. "Yes, very much yes." "Good. I'll send the materials." Foster accepted a cup of coffee from Sarah, who'd been hovering nervously. "And you, young lady, what's your role here?" "I help where I'm needed, sir. Cooking, cleaning, patient care." Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. "Dr. Blackwood and Miss Hale saved my life, same as they've saved so many others. I'm just trying to be useful." "You're succeeding." Foster drained his coffee, prepared to remount. "Keep up the good work, all of you. The territory is better for having you here." After they left, Lydia and Rowan stood in the clearing, looking at the cabin that had become so much more than either had imagined. "Territorial physician," Lydia said, still processing. "That's impressive." "It's terrifying," Rowan admitted. Rowan Hostin. "It means people are counting on me, officially, publicly." "You've been handling that for months already." "True." He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "But it's easier with you beside me." "Good thing I'm not going anywhere, then." That summer, they were married in a small ceremony on the mountain. Marshal Weaver officiated, Judge Foster attended as witness, and the clearing was full of people whose lives they'd touched: patients, families, fellow mountain dwellers who'd learned to trust the doctor and his partner. Lydia wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric given by grateful patients. Rowan wore his best shirt and a genuine smile. And when they exchanged vows, it wasn't about rescue or salvation or anything so dramatic. It was about partnership, about choosing each other every day, about building something good from the ruins of what had been broken. The years that followed were not easy. Winter was always hard. Patients sometimes died despite their best efforts, and the work never truly ended. But they were good years, full of purpose and meaning. Sarah eventually married one of the young trappers who came for treatment and stayed for the company. They built a cabin nearby, started a family, and Sarah continued helping with medical care, specializing in midwifery. The practice grew. Other healers, drawn by stories of the mountain sanctuary, came to learn and contribute. What had started as one man's exile became a community of outcasts and healers, people who'd been broken by the world and chose to heal it instead of hiding from it. Lydia became a certified nurse, one of the first in the territory. She taught others, wrote papers on high country medicine, and became known in her own right as an expert in treating injuries and illnesses specific to mountain living. And Rowan, the beast of Blackwood Mountain, became something else entirely. A respected physician, a teacher, a man who'd transformed his exile into a calling. On an autumn evening, 20 years after Lydia had first stumbled onto his trail, they sat together on the porch they'd expanded to accommodate visiting doctors and nurses in training. The mountain spread below them in shades of gold and crimson, impossibly beautiful in the fading light. "Do you ever think about how it started?" Lydia asked, her hand in his. "About how close I came to dying on that trail?" "Sometimes." Rowan squeezed her hand. "And then I think about everything that came after. How your arrival gave me purpose again. How we built this together. We saved each other." "We did." He pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the world in fire. Below them, the clinic glowed with lamplight. Inside, a new doctor was examining a patient, while a nurse in training assisted. The work continued, the mission endured, and the mountain that had once been a place of exile had become a beacon of hope. Two people, discarded by a cruel world, had chosen to build something better. They'd transformed pain into purpose, exile into sanctuary, and loneliness into love. And in doing so, they'd proven that dignity, when finally protected and nurtured, could change everything. The mountain knew their story. The pines whispered it in their ancient language. The streams carried it down to the valleys below. And people told it around fires and dinner tables, the tale of the beast who was never a monster, and the woman who refused to die. They told it as a reminder that the world's judgment isn't final, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the people we're told to fear are exactly the ones we need to find. And on Blackwood Mountain, where two broken people had built something unbreakable, the work continued. The healing endured. And love, hard-won and carefully tended, flourished in the thin mountain air. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.